Quincunx by Walter de la Mare. On opening the door, and in no good humour at so late and apparently timid a summons, I fancied at first glance that the figure standing at the foot of the fore-garden steps was my old and precious friend Henry Beverley, unexpectedly back in England again. At the moment there was only obscured moonlight to see him by, and he stood rather hummocked up and partly in shadow. If it hadn't been Henry, one might have supposed this visitor was the least bit apprehensive. "Bless my heart," I began, delight mingled with astonishment, then paused. For at that moment a thin straight shaft of moonlight had penetrated between the chimney stack and shone clear into the face of a far less welcome visitor, Henry's brother, Walter. I knew he was living rather dangerously near, but had kept this knowledge to myself, and now, in his miniature car, which even by moonlight I noticed would have been none the worse off for a dusting, he had not only routed me out, but was almost supplicating me to spend the night with him, in a house which had, I heard with surprise, been left to him by an eccentric aunt, recently deceased, about 2 miles away. Seldom can moonshine have flattered a more haggard face. Had he no sedative? Sedatives or not, how could I refuse him? Besides, he was Henry's brother. So, having slowly climbed the stairs again, with a lingering glance of regret at the book I had been reading, I extinguished my green glass-shaded lamp, the reflex effects of which may have given poor Walter an additional pallor, pushed myself into a greatcoat and jammed a hat on my head, and in a moment or so we were on our way, with a din resembling that of a van-load of emptied biscuit tins. I am something of a snob about cars, though I prefer them borrowed. It was monstrous to be shattering the silence of night with so fiendish a noise, all the blinds down and every house asleep, on such a night. And as for poor Walter's gear-changing, heaven help the hardiest of army lorries. "Of course," he repeated, "it would be as easy as chalk to dismiss the whole affair as pure fancy. But that being so, how could it possibly have stood up to repeated rational experiment? I don't think I really care a hoot concerning the ghostly side of this business. Not in the least. I am out for the definite. I am dog-tired, and I am all but beaten." Beaten, I thought to myself, not without some little satisfaction. But beaten by what? By whom? "Beaten!" I shouted through the din. We were turning a corner. "You see, for very good reasons I don't doubt, my late old aunt could not away with me. She found precious little indeed to please her in my complete side of the family, not even the saintly Henry. My own idea is that all along she had been in love with my father, and I, thank heaven, don't take after him. There is a limit to imbecile impracticality, and—" he dragged at his handbrake, having failed to notice earlier a crossroad immediately in front of us under a lamp-post. "She never intended me to inherit so much as a copper bed-warmer or the leg of a chair. Irony was not her strong point. Otherwise, I think she might have bequeathed me her wheezy old harmonium. I always had Salvation Army leaning. But fate was too quick for her, and the house came to me, the least beloved of us all. At first, merely out of curiosity, I decided to live in the place. But there's living and living, and there's deucedly little cash." "But she must have," I began. "Of course she must have," he broke in. "Even an old misbegotten aunt by marriage can't have lived on air. She had money, it was meant, I believe. She mistrusted lawyers, for my cousin Arthur and the rest, and," he accelerated, "I am as certain as instinct and common sense can make me that there are stocks, shares, documents, all sorts of riff-raff, and possibly private papers hidden away somewhere in her own old house, where she lived for donkey's years, where I am trying to exist now." He shot me a rapid glance, rather like an animal looking round. "In short, I am treasure hunting, and there's interference. That's the situation. Naked and a bit ashamed of it. But the really odd thing is, she knows it." "Knows what?" "She knows I'm after the loot," he answered, "and cannot rest in her grave." "Wait till you have seen her face, my dear fella, then scoff if you can. She was a secretive old cat, and she hated bipeds. Soured, I suppose. And she never stirred out of her frowsy seclusion for nearly 20 years. And now, her poor Arthur is left gasping. She is fully aware of what her old enemy is at. Of every move I make, it's a fight, well, past the death between us, and she is winning." "But my dear Beverly," I began. "My dear Rubbish," he said, squeezing my arm. "I am as sane as you are, only a little jagged and peaked. Besides, I'm not dragging you out at this time of night on evidence as vague as all that. I'll give you positive proof. Perhaps you shall have some picking." We came at length to a standstill before his antiquated inheritance, an ugly, awkward house. It abutted sheer onto the pavement. A lamp shone palely on its walls, its few beautifully proportioned windows, and it seemed, if possible, a little quieter behind its 2 bay trees, more resigned to night than even its darkened neighbours were. We went in, and Beverly, with a candle, led the way down a long corridor. "The front room," he said, pointing back, "is the dining room. There's nothing there, simply the odour of 50 years of lavendered cocoon, 50 years of seed cake and sherry, but even to sit on, there alone, munching one's plebeian bread and cheese, is to become conscious, well, is to become conscious. In here, though, is the mystery." We stood together in the doorway, peering beneath our candle into a low-pitched, silent, strangely attractive and old-fashioned parlour. Everything within it, from its tarnished cornice to its little old parrot-green beaded footstool, was the accumulated record of one mind, one curious, solitary, human individuality. And it was as silent and unresponsive as a clam. "What a fascinating old lady," I said. "Yes," he answered in a low voice. "There she is." I turned in some confusion, but only to survey the oval-painted portrait of Miss Lemure herself. She was little, narrow, black-mittened, straight-nosed, becurled, and she encountered my eyes so keenly, darkly, tenaciously, that I began to sympathize with both antagonists. "Now, this is the problem," he said, making a long nose at it and turning his back on the picture. "I searched the house last week from garret to cellar and intend to begin again. The doubloons, the diamonds, the documents are here somewhere. And as RLS said in another connection, if she's hide, then I'm seek. On Sunday I came in here to have a think. I sat there in that little chair by the window, staring vacantly in front of me, when presently, in some indescribable fashion, I became aware that I was being stared at." He touched the picture hanging up on its nail behind him with the back of his head. "So we sat, she and I, for about 10 solid minutes, I should think. Then I tired of it. I turned the old sphinx to the wall again and went out. A little after 9, I came back. There wasn't a whisper in the house. I had my supper, sat thinking again, and fell asleep. When I awoke, I was shivering cold. I got up immediately, went out, shut the dining room door with my face towards this one, went up a few stairs, my hand on the banister, and then vaguely distinguished by the shadow that the door I had shut was ajar. I was certain I had shut it. I came back to investigate and saw her. He nodded towards the picture again. I had left her, as I supposed, in disgrace, face to the wall. She had, it seemed, righted herself, but this may have been a mistake. So I deliberately took the old lady down from her ancestral nail and hid her peculiarly intent physiognomy in that cushion. Dare not, wild heart, grow fonder. Lie there, my love, lie yonder. Then I locked windows, shutters and doors, and went to bed. He paused and glanced at me out of the corner of his eye. I dare say it sounds absurd, but the next morning when I came down, I dawdled about for at least half an hour before I felt impelled to open this door. The chair was empty. She was up. A charwoman, I ventured. On Tuesdays, Fridays, and at the weekends, he said. You're sure of it? He looked vaguely at me, tired and protesting. Oh yes, he said. Last night was my 5th experiment. And you want me? Just to stay here and keep awake? I can't, that's all. Theorizing is charming and easy, but the nights are short. You don't appear to have a vestige of nerves. Tell me who is playing this odd trick on me. Mind you, I know already. Somehow, it's this old Shees who's responsible, who's maneuvering. But how? I exchanged a long look with him, with the cold blue gaze in the tired, pallid face, then glanced back at the portrait, into those small, feminine, dauntless, ink-black eyes. He turned away with a vague shrug of his shoulders. Of course, he said coldly, if you'd rather not. Go to bed, Beverly, I answered. I'll watch till morning. We are, you say, absolutely alone in this house. Physically, yes, absolutely alone. Apart from that old cat, there's not so much as a mouse stirring. No rival heirs, no positive claimant. None, he said, though, of course, it's only my aunt. We stood in silence. Well, good night then, but honestly, I'm rather sceptical. He raised his eyebrows, faintly smiled, something between derision and relief, lifted the portrait from the wall, carried it across the room, leaned it against the armchair in the corner. There, he muttered. Check, you old witch. It's very good of you. I'm sick of it. It has relieved me immensely. Good night. He went out quickly, leaving the door ajar. I heard him go up the stairs, and presently another door above slammed. I thought at first how few candles stood between me and darkness. It was not too late to look for more. Not, of course, that I felt any real alarm. Only a kind of curiosity that might perhaps leap into something a little different when off its guard. I sat down and began meditating on Beverly, his nerves, his pretenses, his venomous hatred of, well, what? Of a dozen things. But beneath all this, I was gazing in imagination straight into the pictured eyes of a little old lady, already months in her grave. The hours passed slowly. I changed from chair to chair, TEG, gift book, albums of fading photographs, old picture magazines. I pored over some marvelously fine needlework and a few enchanting little watercolors. My candle languid. Its successor was kindled. I was already become cold, dull, sleepy, and depressed, when, in the extreme silence, I heard the rustling of silk. Screening my candle with my hand, I sat far back into my old yellow damask sofa. Slow, shuffling footsteps were quietly drawing near. I fixed my eyes on the door. A pale light beyond it began stealing inward, mingling with mine. Faint shadows zigzagged across the low ceiling. The door opened wider, stealthily, and a most extraordinary figure discovered itself and paused on the threshold. For an instant I hesitated, my heart thumping at my ribs, and then I recognized beneath a fantastic disguise no less tangible an interloper than Beverly himself. He was in his pajamas, his feet were bare, but thrown over his shoulders was an immense old cashmere shawl that might have once graced Prince Albert's exhibition in the Crystal Palace, and his head was swathed in what seemed to be some preposterous 18th century night gear. The other hand outstretched, he was carrying his candlestick a few inches from his face, so that I could see his every feature with exquisite distinctness between his voluminous headdress. It was Beverly, right enough. I noticed even a very faint likeness to his brother Henry, unperceived till then. His pale eyes were wide and glassily opened, but beneath this face, as from out of a mask, keen, wizened, immensely absorbed, peered his little old enemy's unmistakable visage, Miss Lemures. He was in a profound sleep, there could be no doubt of that. So closely burned the flame to his entranced face I feared he would presently be setting himself on fire. He moved past me slowly, with an odd, jerky, constricted gait, something like that of a very old lady. He was muttering, too, in an aggrieved, queer, far-away voice. Stooping with a sigh, he picked up the picture, returned across the room, drew up and mounted the parrot-green footstool, and groped for the nail in the wall not 6 inches above his head. At length he succeeded in finding it, sighed again, and turned meditatively, his voice rising, a little shrill as if in altercation. Once more he passed me by unheeded, and came to a standstill, for a moment peering through the curtains a few inches withdrawn into the starry garden. Whether the odd consciousness within him was aware of me, I cannot say. Those unspeculating, window-like eyes turned themselves full on me, crouched there in the yellow sofa. The voice fell to a whisper. I think that he hastened a little. He went out and closed the door, and I'd swear my candle solemnly ducked when his was gone. I huddled myself up again, pulled up a rug, and woke to find the candle stub still alight in the dusk of dawn, battling faintly together to illuminate the little vivid painted face leaning from the wall. And that, on my soul, showing not a symptom of fatigue in this delicate spring daybreak, indeed appeared more redoubtable than ever. I sat for a time undecided what to be doing, what even to be thinking, and then, as if impelled by an inspiration, I got up, took down again the trophy from its nail, and with my penknife gently prised open the back of its gilded frame. Surely it had occurred to me it could not be mere vanity, mere caprice or rancour that could take such posthumous pains as this. Perhaps, ever dimly aware of it as he was in his waking moments, merely the pressing subconscious thought of the portrait had lured Beverly out of his sleep. Perhaps. I levered up the thin dusty wood. There was nothing beneath. I drew it out from the frame, and then was revealed, lightly pasted on the back, a scrap of yellowed paper, sprawled with 5 crosses in the form of a quincunx. In one corner of this was a large capital Italianate P, and beneath the central cross was drawn a small square. Here was the veritable answer before my eyes. How very like old age to doubt its memory even on such a crucial matter as this. Or was it only doubt? For whose guidance had this odd quincunx been intended? Not for Walter Beverley's, that was certain. Standing even where I was, I could see between the curtains the orchard behind the house, pale in the dawn, with its fast-fading fruit blossoms. There, then, lay concealed the old lady's secret hoard. We had but to exercise a little thought, a little dexterity and precaution, and Beverley had won. And then, suddenly, impetuously, rose up in my mind an obstinate distaste of meddling in the matter. Surely, if there is any such thing as desecration, this would be desecration. I glanced at the odd, attentive face looking up at me, the face of one who had, it seemed, so easily betrayed her most intimate secret, and in some unaccountable fashion there now appeared to be something quite other than mere malice in its concentration, a hint even of the apprehension and entreaty of a heart too proud to let them break through the veil of the small, black, fearless eyes. I determined to say nothing to Beverley, watch yet again, and, if I could find a chance, dig by myself, and to make sure of the actual contents of Miss Lemur's treasury before surrendering it to her greedy, insensitive heir. So once more the portrait was rehung on its rusty nail. He was prepared for my skepticism, but he did not believe, I think, that I had kept unceasing watch. I'm sure, he said repeatedly, absolutely sure that what I told you last night has recurred repeatedly. How can you disprove my positive personal evidence by this one failure? By a million negatives. It is you who are to blame, that tough, bigoted, common sense of yours. I willingly accepted his verdict and offered to watch once more. He seemed content, and yet by his incessant restlessness and the curious questioning dismay that haunted his face, I felt that his nocturnal guest was troubling and fretting him more than ever. It was a charming old house, intensely still, intensely self-centered, as it were. One could imagine how unwelcome the summons of death would be in such a familiar home on earth as this. I wandered and brooded and searched in the garden, and found at length without much difficulty my quincunx. The orchard was full of fruit trees, cherry, plum, apple, but the 5 towering pear trees, their rusty crusted bloom not yet all shed, might become at once unmistakably conspicuous to anyone in possession of the flu, though not till then. But how hopeless a contest had my friend set himself with no guidance and one spade, against such an aunt, against such an orchard. Evening began to narrow in the sky. My host and I sat together over a bottle of wine. Much as he seemed to cling to my company, I knew he longed for solitude. Twice he rose, as if urged by some sudden caprice to leave me, and twice he sat down again in even deeper constraint. But soon after midnight, I was left once more to my vigil. This time I forestalled his uneasy errand and replaced the portrait myself. I rested a while, then, when it was still very early morning, I ventured out into the mists of the garden to find a spade. But I had foolishly forgotten on which side of the midmost tree Miss Lemur had set her telltale square. So back again I was compelled to go, and this time I took the flimsy, precious scrap of paper with me. Somewhere a waning moon was shedding light, for the mists of the garden were white as milk, and the trees stood phantom-like above the drenched grasses. I pinned the paper to the midmost pear tree, measured out with my eye a rough narrow oblong a foot or 2 from the trunk, and drove the rusty spade into the soil. At that instant I heard a cautious, minute sound behind me. I turned and once more confronted the pathetic, bedizened figure of the night before. It was fumbling with the handle of the window, holding aloft a candle. The window opened at length, and Beverly stood peering out into the garden. I fancied even a shrill voice called, and then, without hesitation, with the same odd, shuffling gait, Beverly stepped out onto the dew-damped gravel path and came groping towards me. He stood there, quietly watching me, not 2 paces distant, and so utterly still was the twilight that his candle flame burned slim and unwavering in the mist, shedding its small pale light on leaf-sprouting, flowerless bough and dewdrop, and upon that strange, set, haunted face. I could not gaze very long into the grey, unseeing eyes. His lips moved, his fingers, oddly bent, twitched, and then he turned from me. The large pale eyes wandered to my spade, to the untrampled grasses, and finally suddenly fixed their gaze on the tiny square of fading paper. He uttered a little cry, shrill and desperate, and stretched out his hand to snatch it, but I was too quick for him. Doubling it up, I thrust it into my pocket and stepped back beneath the trees. Then, intensely anxious not to awaken the sleepwalker, I drew back with extreme caution. Nonetheless, I soon perceived that, however gradual my retreat, he was no less patiently driving me into a little shrubbery where there would be no chance of eluding him, and we should stand confronting one another face to face. I could not risk a struggle in such circumstances. The wave of heat spread over me. I tripped and then ran as fast as I could back to the house, hastened into the room and threw myself down in my old yellow sleeping place, closing my eyes as if I were lost to the world. Presently followed the same faint footfall near at hand. Then, hearing no sound at all and supposing he had passed, I cautiously opened my eyes, only to gaze once more unfathomably deep into his, stooping in the light of his candle, searching my face insanely, entreatingly. I cannot describe with how profound a disquietude. I did not stir until, with a deep sigh like that of a tired-out child, He turned from me and left the room. I waited a while, my thoughts like a disturbed nest of ants. But what should I do? To whom was my duty obligatory? To Beverly, feverishly hunting for wealth not his, even if it existed, by else than earthly right, or to this unquiet spirit that I could not but believe had taken possession of him, struggling only I knew how bravely, piteously and desperately to keep secret? What? Not mere money or valuables, or private papers, or personal secrets which might lie hidden beneath the shadow of the pear tree. Surely never had eyes pleaded more patiently and intensely and less covetously for a stranger's chivalry, nor from a wilder ambush than these that had but just now gazed into mine. What was the secret? What lure was detaining on earth a shade so much in need of rest? I took the paper from my pocket. Light was swiftly flowing into the awakening garden. A distant thrush broke faintly into song. Undecided, battling between curiosity and pity, between loyalty to my friend and loyalty to even more than a friend, to this friendless old woman's solitary, perturbed spirit, I stood with vacant eyes upon the brightening orchard, my back turned on the portrait and room. A hand, no man's, asleep or awake, touched mine. I turned, debated no more. The poor jaded face was grey and drawn. He seemed himself to be inwardly wrestling, possessed against possessor, and still the old bygone eyes within his own, across how deep an abyss, argued, pleaded with mine. They seemed to snare me, to persuade me beyond denial. I held out the flimsy paper between finger and thumb. Like the limb of an automaton, Beverly's arm slowly raised his guttering candle. The flame flowed soft and blue. I held the paper till its heat scorched my thumb. Something changed. Something, but just now there, was suddenly gone. The old drawn face melted, as it were, into another, and Beverly's voice broke out inarticulate and feverish. I sat him down and let him slowly awaken. He stared incredulously to and fro from the window to me, to the portrait, and at last his eye fell on his extraordinary attire. "I say," he said, "what's this?" "Seemingly," I said, "they are the weeds of the malevolent aunt who has been giving you troubled night." "Me?" he said, not quite free from sleep. "Yes," I said. He yawned. "Then I have been fooled," he said. I nodded. I think that even tears came into his eyes. The May morning choragium of the wild birds had begun, every singer seemingly a soloist in the enraptured medley of voices. "Well, look here," he said, nodding a stupid, sleep-drowsed head at me. "Look here. What, you think of an aunt who hates a fellow as much as that, eh? What do you think?" "I don't know what to think," I said. That was The Quincunx by Walter de la Mare, and this is the part of the podcast where I talk about the story. I say something briefly about the author and then talk more about the story and my reaction to it, any thoughts that spiraled off because of that, because of those reactions and impressions. You know, it's not mandatory. If you've got other things to do, don't worry, I'm not offended. But for those of you who are here, let's start. So Walter de la Mare was born in 1873 and died in 1956. He was English, and he's actually best known for his poetry and children's literature. He was born in Kent in England, began writing when he was very young. He often combines the supernatural with the ordinary, reflecting his interest in the mysterious and otherworldly. His most famous works include Memoirs of a Midget, 1921, The Return, 1910, and Collected Poems, 1942. His style is characterized by rich imagery, lyrical language, and a sense of unease or ambiguity. Start again. And a sense of unease or ambiguity. I'm sure you can recognize all of those elements in this story. He often explored themes of childhood memory and the passage of time. I think in this we're looking at the function of a ghost. De la Mare received critical acclaim for his writing and won several awards during his lifetime. His influence on modern literature, particularly in these genres that we've spoken about, that continues to be acknowledged today. So, the Quincunx itself. It has an interesting publication history that spans several decades. It was first published in December 1906 in the edition of Ladies' Realm, a popular British magazine of the early 20th century. So this original version introduced readers to de la Mare's unique approach to ghost stories, and I think he will. I mean, the key factor in this story is that the ghost appears to possess its nephew rather than actually appear as an apparition, which is unusual. I'm not sure I've come across it at all. I mean, we have stories of possession, particularly much later, but not in this kind of way. Usually they're demonic, but this isn't. This is the ghost is trying to communicate. So, published in 1906, and then nothing happened to it. Didn't appear again until he revised the story in 1955 for his collection A Beginning and Other Stories. So he waited 50 years to revise it, and the revised version, you can look at both of those versions and compare them. Now, I don't have a copy of the early version, so the same revised version, which is one we've heard, was subsequently included in the posthumous collection Short Stories 1927 to 1955, published after his death, gathering up his short fiction. So what is a Quincunx? There was a famous book by Charles Palliser called The Quincunx. I remember reading it. I remember buying it in Henley-on-Thames one day when I was there, and taking it home and being enthralled and being one of those books. This is Charles Palliser's book. I couldn't put down. So that introduced me to the idea of a Quincunx, which is hard to say. Sounds like quince, doesn't it? What was that line from a poem by Victoria Adams? Chewing on a kumquat, thinking of Keats. There you go. So there's nothing really. The kumquat has nothing to do with the Quincunx. They just sound kind of similar to my sparky mind. So a Quincunx is a geometric pattern consisting of 5 points arranged in a cross, with 4 points forming a square or rectangle and the 5th point positioned at the centre. This arrangement resembles a 5-dot pattern found on dice or dominoes. So now you know when you're playing dice or dominoes, you can go, oh, that's a Quincunx. And people go, what? The term Quincunx comes from the Latin word quinque, meaning 5, and uncia, meaning 12th part, originally referring to a coin worth 5/12ths, as in ancient Rome, of an ass. Apparently, I don't know what an ass is. In various contexts, the Quincunx pattern has symbolic, practical or aesthetic applications. It's used in agriculture for efficient planting layouts, in heraldry as a decorative element, and in architecture with pleasing visual balance. In literature and mysticism, the Quincunx often carries deeper symbolic meanings, representing harmony, balance, or the 4 elements plus a central unifying force. You may know that the 4 elements are earth, water, air, fire, and the 5th is spirit. There you go, now you know, if you didn't know before. And you may have known. So that is potentially relevant to this story. I don't know if de la Mare was making that point, but in this story, the Quincunx pattern is a crucial clue linking the physical world with the supernatural, and guiding the character towards the hidden treasure, thus becoming a central motif in the narrative, so they never dig up the treasure, of course. The Quincunx explores several interconnected themes, weaving a complex narrative that blends the supernatural with human nature. At its core, the story delves into the persistence of the past and its influence on the present. Okay, sounds very Derrida, doesn't it? Hauntological. Symbolized by the ant's lingering spirit and her hidden treasure. This theme is closely tied to the idea of unresolved conflicts and secrets, as the ant's unfulfilled desires and hidden wealth continue to affect the living long after her death. So what were her unfulfilled desires that are hinted at? That she may have had a hankering for his father, Walter Beverley's father. So that's her unfulfilled desire. She did not intend him to get the money. I think that's the point here. We look at the role of ghosts in literature. The classic is revenge. Think of Hamlet's father. Then we have unfinished business, or a warning as well. Jacob Marley's ghost. Yeah, guidance or protection, and the bloody baron in J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter, who helps Harry find the lost diadem of Ravenclaw, a symbol of guilt, as in Macbeth. I think is there guilt in this? Manifestations of grief, potentially. Portals to the afterlife? Nah. Warnings or omens? No. Historical echoes, psychological projections and social critique. I think in this one, it's the classic unfinished business. There is something the ghost has not achieved. And of course, the spiritualists said this is why ghosts hang around, because there are things that are not done that should be done, or whether that is... And it's often righting wrongs. So ghosts in literature and in folklore are very moral creatures. Not always, but often. And in this case, I think the wrong is she wasn't portrayed as a particularly nice woman, and we might psychoanalyze her, which we have no right to do really, because de la Mare doesn't do it. But we might say that she did have an unrequited love, or unresolved love for Beverly's father, Walter Beverly's father, and because of that, never married, and basically dedicated her life, wasted her life, if you like, hankering after a man she couldn't have. Maybe, we don't know that, but it made her quite bitter. And anyway, let's go on a little bit. Identity and possession. Yeah, Walter's possession, being possessed by his aunt. What's that about? And blurring of identities raises questions about the boundaries between the living and the dead. I think that's really interesting, and I think that we'd have to go a bit deeper than, de la Mare's story. We'd have to kind of try and guess what the unconscious of de la Mare was doing in putting this story together. And again, we have no right to psychoanalyze de la Mare either, but people do it all the time. I think, given that he's dead, he may be looking down on me now. I'm a big fan of de la Mare. If you listen to my sleepy folklore, late night sleep radio, you'll have heard me quote from his book, Behold This Dream. I'm looking at it right now. So I love his poetic style, really, and this gently gothic-y supernatural. It's never really particularly scary. It's just, I was reading a guy, one of these blogs, and he was talking about Thomas Ligotti's work, and he was talking about writing and saying, how we talk about literary fiction being character-driven, the way we become interested in the characters, and genre fiction being narrative-driven, i.e. the characters are secondary and we're really interested in what's going to happen, the plot. And he suggested that in Ligotti, given that the characters often aren't very nice, and the plot doesn't go anywhere, that we read them for the vibes. And I actually think that's right, I think a lot of this ghost stories particularly, and de la Mare perhaps more than most, we're just doing it for the vibe. We're doing it to be there and soak up the atmosphere and feel all kind of tragic and gothic, as I certainly do. But we started off this talk about psychoanalyzing Walter de la Mare, and I don't know the man. What is it about the ant, though, him appearing as the ant? He doesn't appear as a bog-standard ghost, which would have been easy to do. The two of them could have been in the house, and the man could have seen the ghost of the ant. He kind of sort of does through the picture. There's something kind of as if the picture itself is possessed by the spirit of the ant. There are many stories. I'm thinking of Hugh Nisbet's The Old Portrait, but there's also The Eartonwood Ghost by Eleanor Glynn, and there's a portrait in that as well. So yes, ghostly portraits, but the fact there's not many stories that involve somebody dressing up as in the clothes of the dead person and being effectively possessed by them. That's unusual, and it's hard to know what that means, really. I don't know. If you have any ideas, let me know. Why? So the ant has... So what's the story then? The ant has... he's inherited the house. But he's apparently not a very nice guy. So the ant's reluctance to allow Walter access to a hidden treasure appears to stem from a complex web of personal history, character judgments, and posthumous desires. Throughout the story, it's suggested that the aunt harboured a strong dislike for Walter and his side of the family, possibly due to unrequited feelings for Walter's father, or a general disapproval of their character. I think they talk about it going to Walter says she probably intended it to go to Arthur and that side of the family. So, however, the antipathy is so potent that it seemingly persists beyond the grave, manifesting in the aunt's spectral efforts to thwart Walter's treasure hunt. Indeed, he is definite there's money there, and he's going to find it, and she doesn't want him to. He's got the house, but she doesn't really want to have that. This is kind of supported by, when he first appears, and it's made very clear that the narrator doesn't really relish him coming. He likes the brother, but he doesn't really, and so there's a hint at Walter's disagreeable nature, although in the story, I made him talk very fast on purpose, but he wasn't particularly disagreeable. But he's a far less welcome visitor. So we've got a picture that this guy's not very nice, and this may be the reason why the aunt, and he's greedy, he wants the money, and he's even called greedy and insensitive by the narrator. And so the narrator's growing sympathy for the aunt's ghost. As the story goes on, he moves from being a helper of Walter to find the treasure to actually being very sympathetic to the ghost and not Walter not getting it. So he has an obstinate distaste of meddling in the matter. Perhaps it's not just spite, but a justified attempt to protect the ghost's legacy from someone she deems unworthy. The theme of worthiness and proper stewardship of inheritance is central to the story. Also, you see it as a role of ghosts as well. They are moral creatures, remember. And the bad, they punish the bad and unworthy people. They're kind of moral arbiters, almost like angels in some way. Maybe. But also family secrets. So there is a hint also that it's not just money, but there are some secrets that he isn't the right person to get access to. So he decides then to burn the clue, and the treasure is never turned up. I like the story. It's a simple story, really, in plot terms. It's nothing very elaborate or surprising about it. But the vibes are good, and the dressing up as the aunt is perplexing. But and I don't know what it means. But otherwise the story is very simple and not very groundbreaking, but it's got good vibes. The Body Snatcher by Robert Louis Stevenson. Every night in the year, 4 of us sat in the small parlour of the George at Debenham. The undertaker and the landlord and Fettes and myself. Sometimes there would be more, but blow high, blow low, come rain or snow or frost, we 4 would be each planted in his own particular armchair. Fettes was an old drunken Scotchman, a man of education obviously, and a man of some property since he lived in idleness. He had come to Debenham years ago while still young, and by a mere continuance of living had grown to be an adopted townsman. His blue camlet cloak was a local antiquity, like the church spire. His place in the parlour at the George, his absence from church, his old, crapulous, disreputable vices, were all things, of course, in Debenham. He had some vague, radical opinions and some fleeting infidelities, which he would now and again set forth and emphasise with tottering slaps upon the table. He drank rum, 5 glasses regularly every evening, and for the greater portion of his nightly visit to the George sat, with his glass in his right hand, in a state of melancholy alcoholic saturation. We called him the Doctor, for he was supposed to have some special knowledge of medicine, and had been known, upon a pinch, to set a fracture or reduce a dislocation. But beyond these slight particulars, we had no knowledge of his character and antecedents. One dark winter night, it had struck 9 some time before the landlord joined us, there was a sick man in the George. A great neighbouring proprietor suddenly struck down with apoplexy on his way to Parliament, and the great man's still greater London doctor had been telegraphed to his bedside. It was the first time that such a thing had happened in Debenham, for the railway was but newly open, and we were all proportionately moved by the occurrence. "He's come," said the landlord, after he had filled and lighted his pipe. "He?" said I. "Who? Not the doctor?" "Himself," replied our host. "What's his name?" "Dr. McFarlane," said the landlord. Fettes was far through his third tumbler, stupidly fuddled, now nodding over, now staring mazily around him. But at the last word he seemed to awaken and repeated the name, McFarlane, twice, quietly enough the first time, but with sudden emotion the second. "Yeah," said the landlord, "that's his name, Dr. Wolfe McFarlane." Fettes became instantly sober. His eyes awoke. His voice became clear, loud and steady, his language forcible and earnest. We were all startled by the transformation, as if a man had risen from the dead. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I'm afraid I have not been paying much attention to your talk. Who is this Wolfe McFarlane?" And then, when he had heard the landlord out, it cannot be, he added, "and yet I would like well to see him face to face." "Do you know him, doctor?" asked the undertaker with a gasp. "God forbid," was the reply, "and yet the name is a strange one. It were too much to fancy too. Tell me, landlord, is he old?" "Well," said the host, "he's not a young man, to be sure, and his hair's white, but he looks younger than you. He is older, though, years older, but," with a slap upon the table, "it's the rum you see in my face, rum and sin. This man, perhaps, may have an easy conscience and a good digestion. Conscience, hear me speak. You would think I was some good, old, decent Christian, would you not? But no, not I. I never canted. Voltaire might have canted if he'd stood in my shoes, but the brains," with a rattling fillip on his bald head, "the brains were clear and active, and I saw and made no deductions." "If you know this doctor," I ventured to remark, after a somewhat awful pause, "I should gather that you do not share the landlord's good opinion." Fettes paid no regard to me. "Yes," he said with sudden decision, "I must see him, face to face." There was another pause, and then a door was closed rather sharply on the first floor, and a step was heard upon the stair. "That's the doctor," cried the landlord. "Look sharp, and you can catch him." It was but 2 steps from the small parlour to the door of the Old George Inn. The wide oak staircase landed almost in the street. There was room for a Turkey rug and nothing more between the threshold and the last round of the descent. But this little space was every evening brilliantly lit up, not only by the light upon the stair and the great signal lamp below the sign, but by the warm radiance of the bar-room window. The George thus brightly advertised itself to passers-by in the cold street. Fettes walked steadily to the spot, and we, who were hanging behind, beheld the 2 men meet, as one of them had phrased it, face to face. Dr. McFarlane was alert and vigorous. His white hair set off his pale and placid, although energetic, countenance. He was richly dressed in the finest of broadcloth and the whitest of linen, with a great gold watch chain and studs and spectacles of the same precious material. He wore a broad-folded tie, white and speckled with lilac, and he carried on his arm a comfortable driving coat of fur. There was no doubt but that he became his years, breathing as he did of wealth and consideration, and it was a surprising contrast to see our parlour sot, bald, dirty, pimpled, and robed in his old camlet cloak, confront him at the bottom of the stairs. "McFarlane," he said, somewhat loudly, more like a herald than a friend. The great doctor pulled up short on the 4th step, as though the familiarity of the address surprised and somewhat shocked his dignity. "Toddy McFarlane," repeated Fettes. The London man almost staggered. He stared for the swiftest of seconds at the man before him, glanced behind him with a sort of a scare, and then, in a startled whisper, "Fettes," he said. "You?" "Aye," said the other, "me. Did you think I was deed too? We are not so easy shut of our acquaintance." "Hush, hush!" exclaimed the doctor,
Hush, hush, this meeting is so unexpected. I can see you're unmanned. I hardly knew you, I confess at first, but I'm overjoyed to have this opportunity. For the present, it must be how do you do and goodbye in one, for my fly is waiting, and I must not fail the train. But you shall, let me see, yes, you shall give me your address, and you can count on early news of me. We must do something for you, Fetis. I feel you are out at elbows, but we must see to that for auld lang syne, as we once sang at suppers. Money, cried Fetis, money from you. The money that I had from you is lying where I cast it, in the rain. Dr. Macfarlane had talked himself into some measure of superiority and confidence, but the uncommon energy of this refusal cast him back into his first confusion. A horrible, ugly look came and went across his almost venerable countenance. My dear fellow, he said, be it as you please. My last thought is to offend you. I would intrude on none. I will leave you my address, however. I do not wish it. I do not wish to know the roof that shelters you, interrupted the other. I heard your name. I feared it might be you. I wish to know if, after all, there were a God. I now know that there is none. Begone. He still stood in the middle of the rug between the stair and doorway, and the great London physician, in order to escape, would be forced to step to one side. It was plain that he hesitated before the thought of this humiliation. White as he was, there was a dangerous glitter in his spectacles. But while he still paused uncertain, he became aware that the driver of his fly was peering in from the street at this unusual scene, and caught a glimpse at the same time of our little body from the parlour, huddled by the corner of the bar. The presence of so many witnesses decided him at once to flee. He crouched together, brushing on the wainscot, and made a dart like a serpent, striking for the door. But his tribulation was not entirely at an end, for even as he was passing, Fetis clutched him by the arm, and these words came in a whisper and yet painfully distinct. Have you seen it again? The great rich London doctor cried out aloud with a sharp throttling cry. He dashed his questioner across the open space, and with his hands over his head, fled out of the door like a detected thief. Before it occurred to one of us to make a movement, the fly was already rattling toward the station. The scene was over like a dream, but the dream had left proofs and traces of its passage. Next day the servant found the fine gold spectacles broken on the threshold, and that very night we were all standing breathless by the barroom window, and Fetis at our side, sober, pale, and resolute in look. God protect us, Mr. Fetis, said the landlord, coming first into possession of his customary senses. What in the universe is all this? These are strange things you've been saying. Fetis turned towards us. He looked us each in succession in the face. See if you can hold your tongue, said he. That man, Macfarlane, is no safe to cross. Those that have done so already have repented it too late. And then, without so much as finishing his third glass, far less waiting for the other two, he bade us goodbye and went forth under the lamp of the hotel into the black night. We three turned to our places in the parlour with the big red fire and 4 clear candles, and as we recapitulated what had passed, the first chill of our surprise soon changed into a glow of curiosity. We sat late. It was the latest session I have known in the Old George. Each man, before we parted, had his theory that he was bound to prove, and none of us had any nearer business in this world than to track out the past of our condemned companion and surprise the secret that he shared with the great London doctor. It is no great boast, but I believe I was a better hand at worming out a story than either of my fellows at the George. And perhaps there is now no other man alive who could narrate to you the following foul and unnatural events. In his young days, Fetis studied medicine in the schools of Edinburgh. He had a talent of a kind, the talent that picks up swiftly what it hears and readily retails it for its own.
He worked little at home, but he was civil, attentive, and intelligent in the presence of his masters. They soon picked him out as a lad who listened closely and remembered well. Nay, strange as it seemed to me when I first heard it, he was in those days well favoured and pleased by his exterior. There was, at that period, a certain extramural teacher of anatomy, whom I shall here designate by the letter K. His name was subsequently too well known. The man who bore it skulked through the streets of Edinburgh in disguise, while the mob that applauded at the execution of Burke called loudly for the blood of his employer. But Mr. K, who was then at the top of his vogue, he enjoyed a popularity due partly to his own talent and address, partly to the incapacity of his rival, the university professor. The students at least swore by his name, and Fetis believed himself, and was believed by others, to have laid the foundations of success when he acquired the favour of this meteorically famous man. Mr. K was a bon vivant as well as an accomplished teacher. He liked a sly illusion no less than a careful preparation. In both capacities Fetis enjoyed and deserved his notice, and by the second year of his attendance he held the half-regular position of second demonstrator or sub-assistant in his class. In this capacity, the charge of the theatre and lecture room devolved in particular upon his shoulders. He had to answer for the cleanliness of the premises and the conduct of the other students, and it was a part of his duty to supply, receive, and divide the various subjects. It was with a view to this last, at that time very delicate affair, that he was lodged by Mr. K in the same wind, and at last in the same building with the dissecting rooms. Here, after a night of turbulent pleasures, his hand still tottering, his sight still misty and confused, he would be called out of bed in the black hours before the winter dawn by the unclean and desperate interlopers who supplied the table. He would open the door to these men, since infamous throughout the land. He would help them with their tragic burden, pay them their sordid price, and remain alone when they were gone with the unfriendly relics of humanity. From such a scene, he would return to snatch another hour or two of slumber to repair the abuses of the night and refresh himself for the labours of the day. Few lads could have been more insensible to the impressions of a life thus passed among the ensigns of mortality. His mind was closed against all general considerations. He was incapable of interest in the fate and fortunes of another, a slave of his own desires and low ambitions, cold, light, and selfish in the last resort. He had that modicum of prudence miscalled morality, which keeps a man from inconvenient drunkenness or punishable theft. He coveted besides a measure of consideration from his masters and his fellow pupils, and he had no desire to fail conspicuously in the external parts of life. Thus he made it his pleasure to gain some distinction in his studies, and day after day rendered unimpeachable eye service to his employer, Mr. K. For his day of work he indemnified himself by nights of roaring, blackguardly enjoyment, and when that balance had been struck, the organ that he called his conscience declared itself content. The supply of subjects was a continual trouble to him as well as to his master. In that large and busy class, the raw material of the anatomist kept perpetually running out, and the business thus rendered necessary was not only unpleasant in itself, but threatened dangerous consequences to all who were concerned. It was the policy of Mr. K to ask no questions in his dealings with the trade. They bring the body and we pay the price, he used to say, dwelling on the alliteration, quid pro quo, and again, and somewhat profanely, ask no questions, he would tell his assistants, for conscience' sake. There was no understanding that the subjects were provided by the crime of murder. Had that idea been broached to him in words, he would have recoiled in horror. But the lightness of his speech upon so grave a matter was, in itself, an offence against good manners, and a temptation to the men with whom he dealt. Fetis, for instance, had often remarked to himself upon the singular freshness of the bodies. He had been struck again and again by the hangdog abominable looks of the ruffians who came to him before the dawn. And putting things together clearly in his private thoughts, he perhaps attributed a meaning too immoral and too categorical to the unguarded counsels of his master. He understood his duty, in short, to have three branches: to take what was brought, to pay the price, and to avert the eye from any evidence of crime. One November morning, this policy of silence was put sharply to the test. He had been awake all night with a racking toothache, pacing his room like a caged beast, or throwing himself in fury on his bed, and had fallen at last into that profound, uneasy slumber that so often follows on a night of pain, when he was awakened by the third or fourth angry repetition of the concerted signal. There was a thin, bright moonshine. It was bitter cold, windy and frosty. The town had not yet awakened, but an indefinable stir already preluded the noise and business of the day. The ghouls had come later than usual, and they seemed more than usually eager to be gone. Fetis, sick with sleep, lighted them upstairs. He heard their grumbling Irish voices through a dream, and as they stripped the sack from their sad merchandise, he leaned dozing, with his shoulder propped against the wall. He had to shake himself to find the men their money. As he did so, his eyes lighted on the dead face. He started. He took 2 steps nearer with the candle raised. "God Almighty," he cried, "that is Jane Galbraith." The men answered nothing, but they shuffled nearer the door. "I know her, I tell you," he continued. "She was alive and hearty yesterday. It's impossible she can be dead. It's impossible you should have got this body fairly." "Sure, sir, you're mistaken entirely," said one of the men. But the other looked Fetis darkly in the eyes and demanded the money on the spot. It was impossible to misconceive the threat or to exaggerate the danger. The lad's heart failed him. He stammered some excuses, counted out the sum, and saw his hateful visitors depart. No sooner were they gone than he hastened to confirm his doubts. By a dozen unquestionable marks, he identified the girl he had jested with the day before. He saw with horror marks upon her body that might well betoken violence. A panic seized him, and he took refuge in his room. There he reflected at length over the discovery that he'd made, considering soberly the bearing of Mr. K's instructions and the danger to himself of interference in so serious a business, and at last, in sore perplexity, determined to wait for the advice of his immediate superior, the class assistant. This was a young doctor, Wolfe McFarlane, a high favourite among all the reckless students, clever, dissipated, and unscrupulous to the last degree. He had travelled and studied abroad. His manners were agreeable and a little forward. He was an authority on the stage, skilful on the ice or the links with skate or golf club. He dressed with nice audacity, and to put the finishing touch upon his glory, he kept a gig and a strong trotting horse. With Fetis he was on terms of intimacy. Indeed, their relative positions called for some community of life, and when subjects were scarce, the pair would drive far into the country in McFarlane's gig, visit and desecrate some lonely graveyard, and return before dawn with their booty to the door of the dissecting room. On that particular morning, McFarlane arrived somewhat earlier than his wont. Fetis heard him and met him on the stairs, told him his story, and showed him the cause of his alarm. McFarlane examined the marks on her body.
Yes, he said with a nod. It looks fishy. Well, what shall I do? Asked Fettes. Do? Repeated the other. Do you want to do anything? Least said, soonest mended, I should say. Someone else might recognise her, objected Fettes. She was as well known as the Castle Rock. We'll hope not, said MacFarlane, and if anybody does, well, you didn't, don't you see, and there's an end. The fact is, this has been going on too long. Stir up the mud, and you'll get Kay into the most unholy trouble. You'll be in a shocking box yourself. So will I, if you come to that. I should like to know how any one of us would look, or what the devil we should have to say for ourselves in any Christian witness box. For me, you know, there's one thing certain, that practically speaking, all our subjects have been murdered. MacFarlane, cried Fettes. Come now, sneered the other, as if you hadn't suspected it yourself. Suspecting is one thing, and proof another. Yes, I know, and I'm as sorry as you are that this should have come here, tapping the body with his cane. The next best thing for me is not to recognise it, and, he added coolly, I don't. You may, if you please. I don't dictate, but I think a man of the world would do as I do. And I may add, I fancy, that is what Kay would look for at our hands. The question is, why did he choose us two for his assistance? And I answer, because he didn't want old wives. This was the tone of all others to affect the mind of a lad like Fettes. He agreed to imitate MacFarlane. The body of the unfortunate girl was duly dissected, and no one remarked or appeared to recognise her. One afternoon, when his day's work was over, Fettes dropped into a popular tavern and found MacFarlane sitting with a stranger. This was a small man, very pale and dark with coal-black eyes. The cut of his features gave a promise of intellect and refinement which was but feebly realised in his manners, for he proved, upon a nearer acquaintance, coarse, vulgar, and stupid. He exercised, however, a very remarkable control over MacFarlane, issued orders like the great Bashaw, became inflamed at the least discussion or delay, and commented rudely on the civility with which he was obeyed. This most offensive person took a fancy to Fettes on the spot, plied him with drinks, and honoured him with unusual confidences on his past career. If a tenth part of what he confessed were true, he was a very loathsome rogue, and the lad's vanity was tickled by the attention of so experienced a man. I'm a pretty bad fellow myself, the stranger remarked, but MacFarlane is the boy. Toddy MacFarlane, I call him. Toddy, order your friend another glass. Or it might be, Toddy, you jump up and shut the door. Toddy hates me, he said again. Oh yes, Toddy, you do. Don't you call me that confounded name, growled MacFarlane. Hear him. Did you ever see the lads play knife? He'd like to do that all over my body, remarked the stranger. We medicals have a better way than that, said Fettes. When we dislike a dead friend of ours, we dissect him. MacFarlane looked up sharply as though this jest was scarcely to his mind. The afternoon passed. Gray, for that was the stranger's name, invited Fettes to join them at dinner, ordered a feast so sumptuous that the tavern was thrown into commotion, and when all was done, commanded MacFarlane to settle the bill. It was late before they separated. The man Gray was incapably drunk. MacFarlane, sobered by his fury, chewed the cud of the money he'd been forced to squander and the slights he'd been obliged to swallow. Fettes, with various liquors singing in his head, returned home with devious footsteps and a mind entirely in abeyance. Next day, MacFarlane was absent from the class, and Fettes smiled to himself as he imagined him still squiring the intolerable Gray from tavern to tavern. As soon as the hour of liberty had struck, he posted from place to place in quest of his last night's companions. He could find them, however, nowhere.
So returned early to his rooms, went early to bed, and slept the slept of the just. At 4 a.m, he was awakened by the well-known signal. Descending to the door, he was filled with astonishment to find MacFarlane with his gig, and in the gig, one of those long and ghastly packages with which he was so well acquainted. "What?" he cried. "Have you been out alone? How did you manage?" But MacFarlane silenced him roughly, bidding him turn to business. When they had got the body upstairs and laid it on the table, MacFarlane made at first as if he were going away. Then he paused and seemed to hesitate, and then, "You had better look at the face," said he in tones of some constraint. "You had better," he repeated, as Fettes only stared at him in wonder. "But where and how and when did you come by it?" cried the other. "Look at the face," was the only answer. Fettes was staggered. Strange doubts assailed him. He looked from the young doctor to the body and then back again. At last, with a start, he did as he was bidden. He had almost expected the sight that met his eyes, and yet the shock was too cruel. To see, fixed in the rigidity of death and naked on that coarse layer of sackcloth, the man whom he had left well clad and full of meat and sin upon the threshold of a tavern, awoke even in the thoughtless Fettes some of the terrors of conscience. It was a crass TB which re-echoed in his soul. That two whom he had known should have come to lie upon these icy tables. Yet these were only secondary thoughts. His first concern regarded Wolfe. Unprepared for a challenge so momentous, he knew not how to look his comrade in the face. He durst not meet his eye, and he had neither words nor voice at his command. It was MacFarlane himself who made the first advance. He came up quietly behind and laid his hand gently but firmly on the other's shoulder. "Richardson," said he, "may have the head." Now, Richardson was a student who had long been anxious for that portion of the human subject to dissect. There was no answer, and the murderer resumed. "Talking of business, you must pay me. Your accounts, you see, must tally." Fettes found a voice, the ghost of his own. "Pay you?" he cried. "Pay for that?" "Why, yes, of course you must. By all means, on every possible account you must," returned the other. "I dare not give it for nothing. You dare not take it for nothing. It would compromise us both. This is another case like Jane Galbraith's. The more things are wrong, the more we must act as if all were right. Where does old Kay keep his money?" "There," answered Fettes hoarsely, pointing to a cupboard in the corner. "Give me the key then," said the other calmly, holding out his hand. There was an instant's hesitation, and the die was cast. MacFarlane could not suppress a nervous twitch, the infinitesimal mark of an immense relief, as he felt the key between his fingers. He opened the cupboard, brought out pen and ink and the paper book that stood in one compartment, and separated from the funds in the drawer a sum suitable to the occasion. "Now look here," he said. "There is the payment made. First proof of your good faith. First step to your security. You have now to clinch it by a second. Enter the payment in your book, and then you, for your part, may defy the devil." The next few seconds were for Fettes an agony of thought, but in balancing his terrors, it was the most immediate that triumphed. Any future difficulty seemed almost welcome if he could avoid a present quarrel with MacFarlane. He set down the candle which he had been carrying all this time, and with a steady hand entered the date, the nature, and the amount of the transaction. "And now," said MacFarlane, "it's only fair that you should pocket the lucre. I've had my share already. By the by, when a man of the world falls into a bit of luck, has a few shillings extra in his pocket, I'm ashamed to speak of it, but there's a rule of conduct in the case. No treating, no purchase of expensive class books, no squaring of old debts. Borrow, don't lend." "MacFarlane," began Fettes, still somewhat hoarsely.
I have put my neck in a halter to oblige you. To oblige me, cried Wolf. Oh, come. You did, as near as I can see in the matter, what you downright had to do in self-defence. Suppose I got into trouble, where would you be? This second little matter flows clearly from the first. Mr. Grey is the continuation of Miss Galbraith. You can't begin and then stop. If you begin, you must keep on beginning. That's the truth. No rest for the wicked. A horrible sense of blackness and the treachery of fate seized hold upon the soul of the unhappy student. My God, he cried, but what have I done? And when did I begin? To be made a class assistant, in the name of reason, where's the harm in that? Service wanted the position, Service might have got it. Would he have been where I am now? My dear fellow, said Macfarlane, what a boy you are. What harm has come to you? What harm can come to you if you hold your tongue? Why, man, do you know what this life is? There are two squads of us, the lions and the lambs. If you're a lamb, you'll come to lie upon these tables like Grey or Jane Galbraith. If you're a lion, you'll live and drive a horse like me, like Kay, like all the world with any wit or courage. You're staggered at the first, but look at Kay. My dear fellow, you're clever, you have pluck. I like you, and Kay likes you. You were born to lead the hunt. And I tell you, upon my honour and my experience of life, 3 days from now you'll laugh at all these scarecrows like a high school boy at a farce. And with that, Macfarlane took his departure and drove off up the Wynd in his gig to get under cover before daylight. Fettes was thus left alone with his regrets. He saw the miserable peril in which he stood involved. He saw with inexpressible dismay that there was no limit to his weakness, and that, from concession to concession, he had fallen from the arbiter of Macfarlane's destiny to his paid and helpless accomplice. He would have given the world to have been a little braver at the time, but it did not occur to him that he might still be brave. The secret of Jane Galbraith in the cursed entry in the daybook closed his mouth. Hours passed. The class began to arrive. The members of the unhappy Grey were dealt out to one, to another, and received without remark. Richardson was made happy with the head, and before the hour of freedom rang, Fettes trembled with exultation to perceive how far they had already gone towards safety. For 2 days he continued to watch with increasing joy the dreadful process of disguise. On the third day, Macfarlane made his appearance. He had been ill, he said, but he had made up for lost time by the energy with which he directed the students. To Richardson in particular, he extended the most valuable assistance and advice, and that student, encouraged by the praise of the demonstrator, burned high with ambitious hopes and saw the medal already in his grasp. Before the week was out, Macfarlane's prophecy had been fulfilled. Fettes had outlived his terrors and had forgotten his baseness. He began to plume himself upon his courage and had so arranged the story in his mind that he could look back upon these events with an unhealthy pride. Of his accomplice he saw but little. They met, of course, in the business of the class. They received their orders together from Mr. K. At times they had a word or two in private, and Macfarlane was from first to last particularly kind and jovial, but it was plain that he avoided any reference to their common secret, and even when Fettes whispered to him that he had cast in his lot with the lions and forsworn the lambs, he only signed to him smilingly to hold his peace. At length, an occasion arose which threw the pair once more into a closer union. Mr. K was again short of subjects. Pupils were eager, and it was a part of this teacher's pretensions to be always well supplied. At the same time there came the news of a burial in the rustic graveyard of Glen Corse. Time has little changed the place in question. It stood then as now upon a crossroad.
out of call of human habitations, and buried fathom deep in the foliage of 6 cedar trees. The cries of the sheep upon the neighbouring hills, the streamlets upon either hand, one loudly singing among pebbles, the other dripping furtively from pond to pond, the stir of the wind in mountainous old chestnuts, and once in 7 days the voice of the bell and the old tunes of the precentor were the only sounds that disturbed the silence around the rural church. The Resurrection Man, to use a byname of the period, was not to be deterred by any of the sanctities of customary piety. It was part of his trade to despise and desecrate the scrolls and trumpets of old tombs, paths worn by the feet of worshippers and mourners, and the offerings and the inscriptions of bereaved affection. The rustic neighbourhoods, where love is more than commonly tenacious, and where some bonds of blood or fellowship unite the entire society of a parish, the body snatcher, far from being repelled by natural respect, was attracted by the ease and safety of the task. To bodies that had been laid in earth in joyful expectation of a far different awakening, there came that hasty, lamplit, terror-haunted resurrection of the spade and mattock. The coffin was forced, the cerements torn, and the melancholy relics clad in sackcloth, after being rattled for hours on moonless byways, were at length exposed to uttermost indignities before a class of gaping boys. Somewhat as 2 vultures may swoop upon a dying lamb, Fettes and MacFarlane were to be let loose upon a grave in that green and quiet resting place. The wife of a farmer, a woman who had lived for 60 years and been known for nothing but good butter and a godly conversation, was to be rooted from her grave at midnight and carried dead and naked to that faraway city that she had always honoured with her Sunday's best. The place beside her family was to be empty till the crack of doom, her innocent and almost venerable members to be exposed to that last curiosity of the anatomist. Late one afternoon, the pair set forth, well wrapped in cloaks and furnished with a formidable bottle. It rained without remission, cold, dense, lashing rain. Now and again there blew a puff of wind, but these sheets of falling water kept it down. Bottle and all, it was a sad and silent drive as far as Pennycook, where they were to spend the evening. They stopped once to hide their implements in a thick bush not far from the churchyard, and once again at the Fisher's Tryst, to have a toast before the kitchen fire and vary their nips of whisky with a glass of ale. When they reached their journey's end, the gig was housed, the horse was fed and comforted, and the 2 young doctors in a private room sat down to the best dinner and the best wine the house afforded. The lights, the fire, the beating rain upon the window, the cold, incongruous work that lay before them added zest to their enjoyment of the meal. With every glass their cordiality increased. Soon MacFarlane handed a little pile of gold to his companion. A compliment, he said, between friends, these little damned accommodations ought to fly like pipe lights. Fettes pocketed the money and applauded the sentiment to the echo. "You are a philosopher," he cried. "I was an ass till I knew you. You and Kay between you, by the Lord Harry, but you'll make a man of me." "Of course we shall," applauded MacFarlane. "A man! I tell you, it required a man to back me up the other morning. There are some big, brawling 40-year-old cowards who would have turned sick at the look of the damned thing, but not you. You kept your head. I watched you." "Well, and why not?" Fettes thus vaunted himself. "It was no affair of mine. There was nothing to gain on the one side but disturbance, and on the other I could count on your gratitude, don't you see?" And he slapped his pocket till the gold pieces ran. MacFarlane somehow felt a certain touch of alarm at these unpleasant words. He may have regretted that he had taught his young companion so successfully, but he had no time to interfere, for the other noisily continued in this boastful strain. "The great thing is not to be afraid. Now, between you and me, I don't want to hang, that's practical, but for all cant, MacFarlane,
I was born with a contempt. Hell, God, devil, right, wrong, sin, crime, and all the old gallery of curiosities. They may frighten boys, but men of the world, like you and me, despise them. Here's to the memory of Grey. It was by this time growing somewhat late. The gig, according to order, was brought round to the door with both lamps brightly shining, and the young men had to pay their bill and take the road. They announced that they were bound for Peebles, and drove in that direction till they were clear of the last houses of the town. Then, extinguishing the lamps, returned upon their course, and followed a by-road toward Glen Course. There was no sound but that of their own passage, and the incessant, strident pouring of the rain. It was pitch dark. Here and there, a white gate or a white stone in the wall guided them for a short space across the night, but for the most part it was at foot pace and almost groping that they picked their way through that resonant blackness to their solemn and isolated destination. In the sunken woods that traversed the neighbourhood of the burying ground, the last glimmer failed them, and it became necessary to kindle a match and re-illumine one of the lanterns of the gig. Thus, under the dripping trees, and environed by huge and moving shadows, they reached the scene of their unhallowed labours. They were both experienced in such affairs, and powerful with the spade, and they had scarce been 20 minutes at their task before they were rewarded by a dull rattle on the coffin lid. At the same moment, MacFarlane, having hurt his hand upon a stone, flung it carelessly above his head. The grave, in which they now stood almost to the shoulders, was close to the edge of the plateau of the graveyard, and the gig lamp had been propped the better to illuminate their labours against a tree, and on the immediate verge of the steep bank descending to the stream. Chance had taken a sure aim with the stone. Then came a clang of broken glass. Night fell upon them. Sounds alternately dull and ringing announced the bounding of the lantern down the bank, and its occasional collision with the trees. A stone or two, which it had dislodged in its descent, rattled behind it into the profundities of the glen, and then silence, like night, resumed its sway, and they might bend their hearing to its utmost pitch, but naught was to be heard except the rain, now marching to the wind, now steadily pouring over miles of open country. They were so nearly at an end of their abhorred task that they judged it wisest to complete it in the dark. The coffin was exhumed and broken open, the body inserted in the dripping sack and carried between them to the gig, one mounted to keep its place, and the other, taking the horse by the mouth, groped along the wall and bush until they reached the wider road by the Fisher's Tryst. Here was a faint diffused radiancy which they hailed like daylight. By that they pushed the horse to a good pace and began to rattle along merrily in the direction of the town. They had both been wetted to the skin during their operations, and now as the gig jumped among the deep ruts, the thing that stood propped between them fell now upon one and now upon the other. At every repetition of the horrid contact, each instinctively repelled it with the greater haste, and the process, natural although it was, began to tell upon the nerves of the companions. MacFarlane made some ill-favoured jest about the farmer's wife, but it came hollowly from his lips and was allowed to drop in silence. Still, their unnatural burden bumped from side to side, and now the head would be laid, as if in confidence, upon their shoulders, and now the drenching sackcloth would flap icily about their faces. A creeping chill began to possess the soul of Fettes. He peered at the bundle, and it seemed somehow larger than at first. All over the countryside, and from every degree of distance, the farm dogs accompanied their passage with tragic ululations, and it grew and grew upon his mind that some unnatural miracle had been accomplished, that some nameless change had befallen the dead body. And
that it was in fear of their unholy burden that the dogs were howling.
For God's sake, said he, making a great effort to arrive at speech, for God's sake, let's have a light. Seemingly, MacFarlane was affected in the same direction, for though he made no reply, he stopped the horse, passed the reins to his companion, got down and proceeded to kindle the remaining lamp. They had by that time got no further than the crossroad down at Auchenclinny. The rain still poured as though the deluge were returning, and it was no easy matter to make a light in such a world of wet and darkness. When at last the flickering blue flame had been transferred to the wick and began to expand and clarify and shed a wide circle of misty brightness round the gig, it became possible for the two young men to see each other and the thing they had along with them. The rain had moulded the rough sacking to the outlines of the body underneath. The head was distinct from the trunk, the shoulders plainly modelled. Something at once spectral and human riveted their eyes upon the ghastly comrade of their drive. For some time MacFarlane stood motionless, holding up the lamp. The nameless dread was swathed like a wet sheet about the body and tightened white skin upon the face of Fetis. A fear that was meaningless, a horror of what could not be, kept mounting to his brain. Another beat of the watch, and he had spoken, but his comrade forestalled him. "That is not a woman," said MacFarlane in a hushed voice. "It was a woman when we put her in," whispered Fetis. "Hold that lamp," said the other. I must see her face." And as Fetis took the lamp, his companion untied the fastenings of the sack and drew down the cover from the head. The light fell very clear upon the dark, well-moulded features and smooth-shaven cheeks of a too familiar countenance, often beheld in dreams of both these young men. A wild yell rang up into the night. Each leaped from his own side into the roadway. The lamp fell, broke, and was extinguished. And the horse, terrified by this unusual commotion, bounded and went off toward Edinburgh at a gallop, bearing along with it, sole occupant of the gig, the body of the dead and long dissected Grey.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody dies. Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the wrong door.
That was The Body Snatcher by Robert Louis Stevenson. And I don't know why I haven't done that before, because I do like that story. I like Robert Louis Stevenson, in fact. And I don't know if you've heard my version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which I really enjoyed doing. So go and listen to that if you haven't heard it already. It was a lot of fun. I find sometimes that there are stories, usually longer stories, and I don't know if that's significant, that don't get the love that is proportionate to the enjoyment I got out of doing them. That might be just a thing. If you have seen the movies of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and TV reworkings, it's not as good. They are not as good as the original. Same's true for Phantom of the Opera. If you think, I've seen the musical by, what's his name? The story's loads better. So go and listen to both of those. But not until you've listened to me drone on about Robert Louis Stevenson and The Body Snatcher. I don't know if you know this, but I do spend some time putting together quite extensive notes, sometimes more extensive than others. And if you look in the show notes, you'll see a link to that. And I'm looking at it now, and I think the artwork on it's really nice. And it's all set out for you there. So here we have it. So I say something about the author. I don't presume that you know anything about him, even though you may. And if you, those of you who do, please bear with me. So Robert Louis Stevenson was a renowned Scottish author, essayist and poet born on November 13th, 1815, Edinburgh, Scotland. He died in Samoa, very famously. He moved his families. He wrote a book about the South Seas as well, and travelled around there, but I think it made him ill and killed him, basically. 1894, so he was not an old man by the time he died. I think that just makes it 44. So he was born into a family of lighthouse engineers, and when I was looking through some of his collected works on the Internet Archive, which is a great resource, he dedicated, there's a third volume, I think maybe all the volumes, I was looking at the third volume of his collected works, to his father, which I thought was rather nice, who, he said something really nice being a writer about, which I can't remember exactly now, which was about how so many lights burn bright because of his father, particularly lighthouses, which kept a lot of people alive. Unless you're anti-lighthouse, there may be some conspiracy theory about lighthouses, I don't know. This is what you find these days. You say something which you think is the universally accepted comment, and somebody goes, oh yeah, you're with them, are you? Big lighthouse. Maybe I am. Anyway, getting to the point. So he was always ill, and particularly respiratory issues, and he was confined to bed, where he developed his imagination and honed his storytelling skills. I think he's an excellent prose writer. Some people, Cormac McCarthy, Vladimir Nabokov, one of those, and many others, Graham Greene to an extent, not actually, I'll think of some more prose stylists when I come to it. But they spend a lot of time kind of writing nice, and their language is, John Banville is another one, and I'm just going to keep popping prose stylists out on you now. Raymond Chandler, of course, yeah, but Stevenson is, he does do, but he doesn't go over the top. He engages in, I wouldn't say purple prose, it may be getting a tinge of bluish. I've got to admit now that I'm colourblind, so that blue and purple to me just seem the same colour. And I've told Sheila many times that both blue and green and blue and purple and red and green are and orange and red are the same colour. And you're just winding me up when you say they're different. Shades of the same colour, but they're not different colours. Apparently I don't have the cone for green at all in my eye. I've never missed it, really. Well, that isn't true, but anyway, let's not get onto that. So I'm digressing far more than I anticipated, even as early as this. So all I was saying is I think he's not even workmanlike, he's a great professional. He writes a story and he uses as many words as he needs to convey it. And he doesn't just flourish for the sake of flourishing, but he does have flourishes, but they're always important to the story. We're going to step aside and say, why might a prose flourish be important to the story? Well, they're usually this the rhetorical device of enargia, which is to the Greeks and Romans talk about this, about how we have to put the reader in the scene. If the reader isn't in the scene, they're not with us. So we have to use description, and usually that's when you get the kind of lyrical passages. I think, a digression on digression, I think that what people like stories for all sorts of reasons. They either fall in love with the characters in some way, like Sherlock Holmes. Not in love, but they become very interested in the characters as people. They either think a writer has a great perspicacity and observational skills and is able to talk about a character and portray a character and in some way reveal the reader's feelings that they didn't know anybody shared with them. Yeah, do you see what I'm saying? So they may portray a character and this character is feeling this, and the reader, if the writer's very good, the reader will, oh my goodness, I didn't realise anybody else felt like that, and there will be this bridge, this non-verbal bridge. So that's why, and then they like Oscar Wilde's aphorisms because he seems very clever. He's a great descriptive writer as well. So there are lots of reasons why people like stories, and they're probably, you could write a many-volumed book about this, so I won't do it, and I'm going to pull back and talk about Stevenson. I was just kind of saying what a good guy he is. He wrote Treasure Island, of course, great story. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, fantastic. Kidnapped, didn't like that so much, which showcased his talent for adventure, psychological depth and vivid characterisation. What was I just saying? His writing career took him far from his Scottish roots, and he travelled extensively in Europe and eventually, and America actually, settled in Samoa, where he became known as Tusitala. I don't know if I've said that right, the teller of tales. So his work explores themes of duality, clearly, morality and complexity of human nature, reflecting both his Scottish Calvinist background and more bohemian adult life. I like the way that is, he's got his artist who travels the world with his family, being very, very, very bohemian, and clearly he comes from a kind of ordinary working, not working class particularly, but working for a living family. And I don't know if you know Scotland, but particularly, I think east of Scotland, and Edinburgh prides itself for this no-nonsense. The Scots in general pride themselves for the no-nonsense. I think when you get to the west of Scotland, they're a bit more flamboyant, in the Highlands as well, but the Scots, and I said this with great love, and I think they would agree, pride themselves as being no nonsense. They know what life's about, and it can be quite grim, and so they make the best of it in a very efficient way. Scots produce engineers and very analytical philosophers. David Hume, fantastic philosopher. Adam Smith, people like that. There we are. So that is Robert Louis Stevenson in a nutshell. Not said much about Robert Louis. He said a lot of things about a lot of things. Let's talk about The Body Snatcher, published 1884. So it was published in the Pall Mall Gazette on December 25th, Christmas Day, 1884. Now, they must have realised it was a big story. And remember, there is this tradition of macabre ghost stories, but macabre stories at Christmas. Dickens did a lot of that, but of course M.R. James as well. And the Pall Mall Gazette was a prominent London evening newspaper at the time. So this is, he's already arrived, when this gets out. So it was 1884, and he was born in 1850, so he's only 34. He didn't even write it. It was written 3 years earlier in 1881 when he was staying in Pitlochry. And I'm going to be going through there in a couple of weeks. And we may stop for a sandwich. Last time I was there, absolutely poured down. Anyway, the 3-year gap between writing The Body Snatcher and publication may be due to reservations by Stevenson or his wife Fanny. You can see why though, can't you? So it's a chilling Gothic tale. We'll talk about Gothic in a minute. Inspired by Edinburgh urban legends, explores themes of morality, guilt, and the dark side of medical progress. Funnily enough, as part of my research for this, I read an article by a guy who I think it was something in. He cites the Lancet. It was either on the British Medical Journal or something like that, and they were talking about the ethics of. And although this is fiction, it's based on a real man. Dr. Robert Knox, who he had popular anatomy classes and constant need for cadavers for dissection, and he paid the famous Burke and Hare, the Irish body snatchers who operated in Edinburgh. And of course, Stevenson nods at them by having the people selling him the corpses, Fetis the corpse. Fetis is a famous school, Tony Blair went there, I think. And I think that's just an Edinburgh name he's pulled out. They're Irish, and they were. And of course, that's another personal thing. My dad was from Edinburgh, and his mother was proper Scottish Presbyterian, my grandmother, who I never met, from Perth, or Perthshire anyway, just outside Perth. But my grandfather, who she married, was an Irish Catholic. So, and they lived in the Cowgate and Canongate and round there. And so that, when I did a bit of genealogy, and they're really in the Irish immigrant community area there. And Edinburgh, like Glasgow, of course, but Edinburgh as well, went on to found the Hibernian Football Club, who, of course, all my dad's family support. So yeah, they were poor. In fact, I think my great grandfather's on one of the censuses, his occupation is scavenger, so he's like a rag and bone man as far as I can tell. Anyway, so it's very much rooted in the dark history of early 19th century Edinburgh, particularly its medical community, and we alluded to the medical ethics of that. Medicine's kind of driven. Well, again, this is a multi-volume, not anthology, tome, but and I've of course spent the last 20 years working in the health service. So my dad was a doctor. So there is this ambition and this progress that's driven in the same way as science, and this hunger to know. And then there's the other side of it, which is the so-called bedside manner, which is the compassion. And when I used to do training teach medical students things about mental health, who come and see me and spend days with me, and some of them were interested and some of them couldn't see the point in it at all. And that, for me, typified the two kinds of doctors. Some are technocrats, and they just see it as a technical exercise. Maybe just see it is unfair, but I think most doctors tend to go one way or the other. They are, and GPs tend to be more on the pastoral side. Surgeons tend to be more, and I've met some great surgeons. I've met some rotten surgeons. I don't mean rotten technically, I mean arrogant, insufferable. The people in training used to give me the hardest time with the surgeons and the midwives, both very opinionated, and think they know everything, and they don't. And anyway, so, and it is time and time again in history we've seen medical professionals transgress and step over ethics in pursuit of what they perhaps arrogantly would say, because there's a lot of arrogance in this profession. In fact, I'm going to tell you another story. I don't know if you know, there's a guy called John Campbell. John Campbell has a very popular YouTube channel. Talks about medical issues, and he taught me at one point, and I remember him saying to me, we were talking about personality disorders, and he said, we talked about different kinds, and he said, the narcissistic personality disorder you will find far more commonly in your colleagues than your patients. Yeah, that's true. So I think we've seen time and time again, and we see it here, and Louis Stevenson actually really spotlights it. It's such a brilliant story for that cycle, for that ethical dimension. But if it was just the ethics, oh yes, I've done something bad, I'm really sorry, or I don't think it's bad, which is Wolf McFarlane's view really. But Fetis and Dither he has a conscience. But of course, where does conscience come from? Is conscience about some kind, and I think people do have this, whistleblowers, I was reading an article about whistleblowers, they tend to be driven by their internal moral code. They do things, they do what they consider, what their code tells them is right, for better or for worse, and often ruin their lives by being honest and speaking out. No names named. But many people, many of us perhaps, we do the right thing for fear of being punished. And I think Fetis is that man. And when he thinks he isn't going to be punished, he becomes all very full of himself, doesn't he? And yeah, jingling his money. And of course, that is, perhaps Stevenson at that point, maybe he's laying a little red herring to make us suspect, if we're reading this for the first time, that he's going to get his comeuppance legally. Pride comes before a fall, and that's why. But that isn't really strongly developed. I mean, this is really gothic, isn't it? And we talk about Birkenhead. The other real case that the story is based on was, Jane Galbraith, who he recognises, is an actual case of Mary Patterson, whose body was sold to Dr. Knox by Birkenhead in 1828. So such events contributed to the passage of the Anatomy Act of 1832, which increased the legal supply of cadavers for dissection, reduced the demand for illegally obtained bodies. Again, body snatchers are such a fascinating subject. They would, families would sit and wait. Edinburgh was a real problem in Edinburgh, which was a famous surgical centre, medical centre, but surgical as well. So so it was a big deal, and they used to put guards on, and they used to put mort safes, heavy iron cages placed over graves to deter body snatchers. This is probably why they end up going to the rural village of Glencorse, just outside Peebles, as far as I can tell. I think it's a real place, yeah. I think, he uses real places throughout. I mean, of course, Birkenhead, if you don't know, they were body snatchers, but they actually, the supply didn't meet the demand, so they started killing people, and they killed about at least 16 people and then sold the bodies on. So it's all based on the truth. So funnily enough, I'm in Carlisle, and Carlisle's about 100 miles south of Edinburgh, and there's a case from the early 18th century at St Cuthbert's graveyard here, and it said that there was some Scotchmen. I mean, we're right on the border, so Carlisle's, full of Scottish people, but these were particularly shifty ones. They weren't named as Irish. Maybe if you'd have named as, but also there were lots of Irish there at the time. But anyway, these people came to suspicion of the authorities, and they, I think, it was somewhere like Peebles. Wouldn't be a coffin, but a wooden box that they were shipping the bodies up to Edinburgh to sell. It was that profitable. Came open at a posting house. Apparently they didn't go with the body themselves. They just kind of posted it on, and it came open, and they were discovered, and they'd taken a house down out of the city centre by the Eden, and they were nabbed. And that's a true story. There are details. I mean, I haven't got the details at my fingers. So let's think about Gothic. Just have a think about the Gothic tale. Gothic literature, which was very popular. It comes and goes in waves, doesn't it? It starts in the late 1700s, but certainly 1884. And we have his classic tale, Jekyll and Hyde, also very Gothic. And then we have 1894, I think, top of my head. We have Dracula. We've had Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla. Sheridan Le Fanu was a really popular author. What we don't know, looking back from our position now, is it's like I was reading J.B. Priestley. I was reading some of his stuff the other day, and at one point in the 50s and before, J.B. Priestley was everywhere, and now he's pretty much forgotten. And Le Fanu, we don't know how popular he was, but he would have been a household name. So Carmilla, so the Gothic was very much, there. So, and it says that the setting often takes on a character-like role, becoming an integral part of the story's atmosphere. Well, I think certainly the graveyard at the end is that. There is no naive young maiden, which is very classic. Or an older woman may appear as an aid to evil, or a clergyman might be portrayed as weak or corrupted. We don't have that, but what we do have is the doctor being corrupted. So perhaps if it's that. Misery, mystery and fear of the unknown are central themes of Gothic fiction. Tick, tick, tick. With plots often revolving around shocking and melodramatic events. Tick, tick, that defy explanation. What they do at the end. Omens and portents of doom are common. Didn't get that. Its unique blend of deep passions and chilling dread. It often unfolds in grand decaying architectural settings such as medieval castles, English manors. Well, Edinburgh itself is that. The old town. When you go up Cockburn Street and you look at the tenements up there, it's Gothic on a stick. So very, very handsome city. So is the Body Snatcher Gothic? Yeah, it's got the atmosphere, it's got the rain, bad weather is very Gothic. Usually thunderstorms, but rain will do, snow will do sometimes, but isolated locations in bad weather, yes. Realistic horrors, a bit of body horror almost. We don't give them the graphic details, but it's not uncommon to have a bit of body horror. And growing guilt, lots of guilt, and this is what we have. And it's kind of framed, which I haven't said, of course. The story is framed, although the back end of the frame is lost. It's more an introduction in this mythical English village of Debenham, where Fetis, we presume, has gone to escape his guilty conscience. I mean, the money given to him by Wolf McFarlane, he threw in the gutter. Wish I'd been there, I'd have picked it up. Oh no, what does that say about me morally? No, I would have left it there in the rain. So he, Wolf McFarlane, clearly is affable still. He's pleased to see him, but that is never resolved. And often another issue of the Gothic is there is no happy ending, and that's characteristic of horror stories, as opposed to kind of ghost stories. In many ghost stories, they just wind up and the hero is either better off or usually no worse off. With a horror story, usually the protagonist is worse off. And there is no happy ending to this. He is left with his bad conscience, and nothing can alleviate it or ameliorate it. Okay, so in the notes, which I've done, if you're interested in grave robbing, I recommend you listen to The Hound by H.P. Lovecraft, which I've done. Another story which doesn't get a lot of love, massively gothic in the way that only Lovecraft can do. And then there's another one which is interesting. It's Tego Kane and the Corpse, which is an Irish story. Slightly different, but it does involve a corpse and burying a corpse. So I thought you might like those. I'm on holiday, so if I miss a week, don't worry too much. I'll be back.
Celui-là by Eleanor Scott. I don't for a moment expect you to take my advice, said Dr. Foster, looking shrewdly at his patient. But I'll give it all the same. It's this. Pack a bag with a few things and go off tomorrow to some tiny seaside or mountain place, preferably out of England, so that you won't meet a soul you know. Live there absolutely quietly for 3 or 4 weeks, taking a reasonable amount of exercise, and then write and tell me that you're all right again. Easier said than done, growled Maddox. There aren't any quiet places left that I know of, and if there were, there wouldn't be any digs to be had at no notice. Foster considered. I know the very thing, he cried suddenly. There's a small place on the Breton coast, fishing village, very small and scattered, with a long stretch of beach, heath and moor inland, quiet as can be. I happen to know the curé there fairly well, and he's an extremely decent, homely little chap. Vetier, his name is. He'd take you in. I'll write to him tonight. After that, Maddox couldn't in decency hold out. Old Foster had been very good, really, over the whole thing. Besides, it was nearly as much bother to fight him as it was to go. In less than a week, Maddox was on his way to Kerouac. Foster saw him off with relief. He knew Maddox well, and he understood he was suffering from years of overwork and worry. He understood how very repugnant effort of any kind was to him, or thought he did, but in reality no one can quite understand the state of exasperation or depression that illness can produce in someone else. Yet, as the absurd little train that Maddox took at Lamballe puffed serenely along between tiny rough orchards, the overwrought passenger began to feel soothed. And then, as the line turned north and west, and the cool wind came in from across the dim stretches of moorland, he grew content and almost serene. Dusk had fallen when he got out of the shed that marked the station at Kerouac. The curé, a short, plump man in soutane and broad-brimmed hat, met him with the kind, almost effusive greeting that Breton peasants give to a guest, and conducted the stumbling steps of his visitor to a rough country lane, falling steeply downhill between two high earth-dark banks that smelt of gorse and heather and dampness. Maddox could just see the level line of sea lying before him, framed by the steep banks of the moor on either side. Above, a few pale stars glimmered in the dim sky. It was very peaceful. Maddox fell into the simple life of the Kerouac Presbytery at once. The curé was, as Foster had said, a very homely, friendly little man, always serene and nearly always busy, for he had a large and scattered flock and took a very real interest in the affairs of each member of it. Also, Maddox gathered, money was none too plentiful, for the curé did all the work of the church himself, even down to the trimming of the grass and shrubs that surrounded the little windswept building. The country also appealed very strongly to the visitor. It was at once desolate and friendly, rough and peaceful. He particularly liked the long reaches of the shore, where the tangle of heath and whin gave place to tufts of coarse whitish grass, and then to a belt of shingle and the long level stretches of smooth sand. He liked to walk there when evening had fallen, the moorland on his left rising black to the grey sky, the sea smooth and calm stretching out infinitely on his right, a shining ripple lifting here and there. Oddly enough, Monsieur le Curé did not seem to approve of these evening rambles, but that, Maddox told himself, was common among peasants of all races, and he idly wondered whether this were due to a natural liking for the fireside after a day in the open, or whether there were in it some ancient fear of the spirits and demons that country people used to fear in the dim time entre les chiens et les loups. Anyhow, he wasn't going to give up his evening strolls for a superstition of someone else's. It was near the end of October, but very calm weather for the time of year, and one evening the air was so mild and the faint shine of the stars so lovely that Maddox extended his walk beyond its usual limits. He had always had the beach to himself at that time of the evening, and he felt a natural, if quite unjustifiable, annoyance when he first noticed that there was someone else on the shore. The figure was perhaps 50 yards away. At first he thought it was a peasant woman, for it had some sort of hood drawn over the head, and the arms, which it was waving or wringing, were covered by long hanging sleeves. Then, as he drew nearer, he saw that it was far too tall for a woman, and jumped to the conclusion that it must be a monk or wandering friar of quite exceptional height. The light was very dim, for the new moon had set, and the stars showed a faint diffused light among thin drifts of cloud, but even so, Maddox couldn't help noticing that the person before him was behaving very oddly. It, he couldn't determine the sex, moved at an incredible speed up and down the short stretch of beach, waving its draped arms. Then suddenly, to his horror, it broke out in a hideous cry, like the howl of a dog. There was something in that cry that turned Maddox cold. Again it rose, and again an eerie, wailing, hooting sound, dying away over the empty moor. And then the creature dropped on its knees and began scratching at the sand with its hands. A memory, forgotten until now, flashed into Maddox's mind. A memory of that rather horrible story in Hans Andersen about Anne Lisbeth and the drowned child. The thin cloud obscured the faint light for a moment. When Maddox looked again, the figure was still crouching on the shore, scrabbling with its fingers in loose sand, and this time it gave Maddox the impression of something else, a horrible impression of an enormous toad. He hesitated, and then, swallowing down his reluctance with an effort, walked towards the crouching, shrouded figure. As he approached, it suddenly sprang upright, and with a curious gliding movement, impossible to describe, sped away inland at an incredible speed, its gown flapping as it went. Again Maddox heard the long-drawn, mournful howl. Maddox stood, gazing through the thickening dusk. Of course, it's possible to tell in this light, he muttered to himself, but it certainly did look extraordinarily tall, and what an odd look it had of being flat. It looked like a scarecrow with no thickness. He wondered at his own relief that the creature had gone. He told himself that it was because he loathed any abnormality, and there could be no doubt that the person he had seen, whether it were woman or monk, was crazed, if not quite insane. He walked to the place where it had crouched. Yes, there was the patch of disturbed sand, rough among the surrounding smoothness. It occurred to him to look for the footprints made by the flying figure to see if they bore out his impression of abnormal height, but either the light was too bad for him to find them, or the creature had leapt straight under the belt of shingle. At any rate, there were no footmarks visible. Maddox knelt beside the patch of disturbed sand and, half idly, half in interest, began himself to sift it through his fingers. He felt something hard and smooth, a stone, perhaps. He took it up. It was not a stone, anyhow, though the loose damp sand clung to it so that he could not clearly distinguish it with his handkerchief, and then he saw that it was a box or case, 3 or 4 inches long, covered with some kind of rude carving. It fell open of itself as he turned it about, and he saw that inside was a wrapping of something like, yet unlike, leather. Inside again was something crackled like paper. He looked round to see whether the figure that had either buried or sought this object, he was not sure which it had done, was returning, but he could see nothing but the bushes of the gorse and heath black and stunted against the grey sky. There was no sound but the sigh of the night wind and the gentle lap of the incoming tide. His curiosity proved too strong for him, and he slipped the case into his pocket as he turned homewards. Supper, a simple meal of soup and cheese and cider, was awaiting him when he got in, and he had not time to do more than change his shoes and wash his hands. But after supper, sitting on one side of the wide hearth while the curé smoked placidly on the other, Maddox felt the little box in his pocket and began to tell his host of his queer adventure. The curé's lack of enthusiasm rather dampened him. No, he knew of no woman in the whole of his wide parish who would behave as Maddox described. There was no monastery in the neighbourhood, and if there were, it would not be permitted to the brethren to act like that. He seemed mildly incredulous, in fact, until Maddox, quite nettled, took out the little case and slapped it down on the table. It was a more uncommon object than he had at first supposed. It was, to begin with, extremely heavy and hard, as heavy as lead, but of a far harder metal. The chasing was queer. The figures reminded Maddox of runes, and remembering the prehistoric remains in Brittany, a thrill ran through him. He was no antiquarian, but it occurred to him that this find of his might be an extremely interesting one. He opened the case. As he had thought, there was a scrap of some leathery substance within, carefully rolled around a piece of parchment. That couldn't be prehistoric, of course, but Maddox was still interested. He smoothed it out and began stumblingly to read out the crabbed words. The language was Latin of a sort, and he was so occupied in endeavouring to make out the individual words that he made no attempt to construe their meaning until Father Vettius stopped him with a horrified cry and tried to snatch the document out of his hand. Maddox looked up, exceedingly startled. The little priest was quite pale and looking horrified, as if he'd been asked to listen to the most shocking blasphemy. "Why, mon père? What's wrong?" asked Maddox, astonished. "You should not read things like that," panted the little curé. "It is wrong to have that paper. It is a great sin." "Why? What does it mean? I wasn't translating." A little colour crept back into the priest's cheeks, but he still looked greatly disturbed. "It was an invocation," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "It is a terrible paper that it calls up that one." Maddox's eyes grew bright and eager. "Not really, is it? Honestly?" He opened out the sheet again. The priest sprang to his feet. "No, monsieur, I must beg you, no! You have not understood." He looked so agitated that Maddox felt compunction. After all, the little chap had been very decent to him, and if he took it like that... But he couldn't help thinking that it was a pity to let these ignorant peasants have jobs as parish priests. Really, there was enough superstition in their church as it was without drafting old forgotten country charms and incantations into it. A little annoyed, he put the paper back into its case and dropped the whole thing into his pocket. He knew quite well that if the curé got his hands on it, he would have no scruples whatever about destroying the whole thing. That evening did not pass as pleasantly as usual. Maddox felt irritated by the crass ignorance of his companion, and Father Vettier was quite unlike his customary placid self. He seemed nervous, timid even, and Maddox noticed that when the presbytery cat sprang onto the back of her master's chair and rubbed her head silently against his ear, the curé almost sprang out of his seat as he hurriedly crossed himself. The time dragged until Maddox could propose retiring to bed, and long after he had been in his room, he could hear Father Vettier, for the inner walls of the presbytery were mere lath and plaster, whispering prayers and clicking the beads of his rosary. When morning came, Maddox felt rather ashamed of himself for having alarmed the little priest, as he undoubtedly had done. His compunction increased when he saw Father Vettier as he came in from his early mass, for the little man looked quite pale and downcast. Maddox mentally cursed himself. He felt like a man who's distressed a child, and he cast about for some small way of making amends. Halfway through déjeuner, he had an idea. "Father," he said, "you're making alterations in your church here, aren't you?" The little man brightened visibly. This, Maddox knew, was his pet hobby. "But yes, monsieur," he replied quite eagerly. "For some time now I have been at work, now that at last I have enough. Monseigneur has given me his blessing. It is, you see, that there is beside our church here the fragment of an old building. Oh, but old. One says that perhaps it was also a church or a shrine once, but what do I know? But it is very well built, very strong, and I conceived the idea that one might join it to the church. Figure to yourself, monsieur, I should then have a double aisle. It will be magnificent. I shall paint it naturally to make it all look as it should. The church is already painted of a blue of the most heavenly for the Holy Virgin with lilies in white. I'd hoped for lilies of gold, but gold paint, it is incredible the cost. And the new chapel I will have in crimson for the Sacred Heart, with hearts of yellow as a border. It will be gay, won't it?" Maddox shuddered inwardly. "Very gay," he agreed gloomily. There was something that appealed to him very much in the shabby, whitewashed little church. He felt pained at the very thought of Father Vettier's blue and crimson and yellow. But the little curé noticed nothing. "Already I have begun the present church," he babbled, "and monsieur, you should see it. It is truly celestial, that colour. Now I shall begin to prepare the old building, so that as soon as the walls are built to join it to the present church, I can decorate. They will not take long, those little walls, not long at all, and then I shall paint." He seemed lost in a vision of rapture. Maddox was both amused and touched. Good little chap. It had been a shame to annoy him over that silly incantation business. He felt a renewed impulse to please the friendly little man. "Can I help you at all, Father?" he asked. "Could I scrape the walls for you, or anything like that? I won't offer to paint. I'm not expert enough." The priest positively beamed. He was a genial soul who loved company, even at his work. But even more, he loved putting on thick layers of bright colours according to his long-planned design. To have a companion who did not wish to paint was more than he'd ever hoped for. He accepted with delight. After breakfast, Maddox was taken to see the proposed addition to the church. It stood on the north side of the little church, which of course ran east and west, and as far as Maddox could see, it consisted mainly of a piece of masonry running parallel with the wall of the church. Fragments of walls, now crumbled, almost joined it to the east and west ends of the north wall of the church. It might almost have been at one time a part of the little church. It certainly, as Father Vettier had said, would not take much alteration to connect it to the church as a north aisle. Maddox set to work to chip the plaster facing from the old wall with a good will. In the afternoon, the curé announced that he had to pay a visit to a sick man some miles away. He accepted with great gratitude his visitor's proposal that he should continue with the preparations for the painting of the new aisle. With such efficient help, he said, he would have the addition to the church ready for the great feast of St. Michael, patron saint both of the village and the church. Maddox was delighted to see how completely his plan had worked in restoring the little man's placid good humour. Shortly after 2, Maddox went into the churchyard and resumed his labours. He chipped away industriously and was just beginning to find the work pall when he made a discovery that set him chipping again eagerly at the coat of plaster which later hands had daubed thickly on the original wall. There were undoubtedly mural paintings on the portion he had begun to uncover. Soon he had laid bare quite a large stretch and could see that the decorations formed a band 6 or 7 feet deep, about 2 feet from the ground, nearly the whole length of the wall. The light was fading and the colours were dim, but Maddox could see enough to interest him extremely. The paintings seemed to represent a stretch of the seashore, and though the landscape was treated conventionally, he thought it looked like part of the beach near Kerouac. there were figures in the painting too, and these aroused his excitement. For one at least, was familiar. It was a tall shape, hooded, with hanging draperies. The figure he had seen the night before on the beach. Perhaps it was due to the archaic treatment of the picture that this figure gave him the same impression of flatness. The other figure, it was a figure, was even stranger. It crouched on the ground before the hooded shape, and to Maddox it suggested some rather disgusting animal, a toad, or a thick squat fish. The odd thing was that, although it squatted before the tall figure, it gave the impression of domination. Maddox felt quite thrilled. He peered closely at the painting, endeavouring to make out clearly what it represented, but the short October afternoon was drawing in fast, and beyond his first impression, he could gather very little. He noticed that there was one unexpected feature in the otherwise half-familiar landscape. A hillock or pile of large stones or rocks, on one side of which he could just make out words or fragments of words. Qui peut venir, he read in one place, and lower down, celui qui écoutera et qui viendra, sacrim pendu. There was also some vague object, a pile of seaweed, Maddox thought, lying heaped below the hillock. Little though he knew either of art or of archaeology, Maddox was keenly interested by this discovery. He felt sure that this queer painting must represent some local legend or superstition, and it was very odd that he should have seen, or thought he had seen, that figure on the beach before he had discovered the mural painting. There could be no doubt that he had seen it, that it was no mere fancy of his tired mind. There was the box and the incantation, or whatever it was, in his pocket to prove. And that gave him an idea. It would be extremely interesting if he should find that the old French words on the mural painting and the Latin words on the parchment in any way corresponded. He took the little metal case from his pocket and opened it. Clamabo et exaudiet me. I will call and he will hear. That might be any prayer. Sound rather like a psalm. Quoniamiste qui venire potest. Ah, qui peut venir? What's this? Sacrificium hominum. Heavens. What's that? Far off across the heath he heard a faint cry, the distant howling of the thing he had seen on the beach. He listened intently. He could hear nothing more. Some dog howling, he said to himself. I'm getting jumpy. Where was I? He turned back to the manuscript, but even during the few moments of distraction the light had faded, and he had to strain his eyes to see anything of the words. E paladinis ubi est habitaculum tuum ego te convoco. He read slowly aloud, spelling out the worn writing. I don't think there's anything in the painting to correspond with that. How odd it is. From the marshes where thy dwelling is, I call thee. Why from the marshes, I wonder? E paladinis ubi est habitaculum tuum ego te convoco. He broke off abruptly. Again, there came that dreadful howl. And it certainly was not the howl of a dog. It was quite close. Maddox did not stop to consider. He leapt up, ran through the yard into the presbytery, and locked the door behind him. He went to the front door and locked that too, and he bolted every window in the tiny house. Then, and not till then, did he pause to wonder at his own precipitate flight. He was trembling violently, his breath coming in painful gasps. He told himself that he had acted like a hysterical old maid, like a schoolgirl. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to open a window. He went into the little sitting room and made up the fire to an unwonted size. Then he tried to take an interest in Father Vetier's library of devotional books until the little curé himself should return. He was nervous and uneasy. It seemed to him that he could hear some creature, He told himself that it must be a large dog, or perhaps a goat, snuffling about the walls and under the door. He was inexpressibly relieved when at last he heard the short, decided step of the curé coming up the path to the house. Maddox was restless that night. He had short, heavy snatches of sleep in which he was haunted by dreams of pursuit by that flat, hooded being. And once he woke with a strangled cry and a cold shudder of disgust from a dream that in his flight he had stumbled and fallen face downwards on something soft and cold which moved beneath him, a mass of toads. He lay awake for a long time after that dream, but he eventually slipped into a drowsy state, half waking, half sleeping, in which he had an uncomfortable impression that he was not alone in the room, that something was breathing close beside him, moving about in a fumbling, stealthy way. And his nerves were so overwrought that he simply had not the courage to put out a hand and feel for the matches, lest his fingers should close on something else. He did not try to imagine what. Towards dawn, he fell into an uneasy doze and awoke with a start. Some sound had awakened him. A melancholy howling cry rang in his ears, but whether it had actually sounded or whether it was part of his memories and evil dreams, he couldn't tell. He looked ill and worn at breakfast and gave his bad night as an excuse for failing to continue his work on the old wall. He spent a wretched, moping day. He could settle to nothing indoors. At last, tempted by the mellow October sun, he decided to go for a brisk, short walk. He would return before dusk. He was quite firm about that. And he would avoid the lonely reaches of the shore. The afternoon was delicious. The rich scent of the gorse and heather warm in the sun, and the cool touch from the sea that just freshened the breeze, soothed and calmed Maddox wonderfully. He'd almost forgotten his terrors of the night before. At least he was able to push them into a back corner of his mind. He turned homewards contentedly. Even in his new calm, he was not going to be out after sundown. When his eyes happened to fall on the white road where the declining sun threw his shadow long and thin before him. As he saw that shadow, his heart gave a sudden heavy thud, for a second shadow walked beside his own. He spun round. No mortal creature was in sight. The road stretched empty behind him, and on either hand the moorland spread its breast to the wide sky. He ran to the presbytery like a hunted thing. That evening, Father Vettier ventured to speak to him. "Monsieur," he said rather timidly, "I do not wish to intrude myself into your affairs. That understands itself, but I promised my very good friend, Monsieur Foster, that I will take care of you. You are not a Catholic, I know, but will you wear this?" As he spoke, he took from his own neck a thin silver chain to which was attached a little medal, black with age, and held it out to his guest. "Thank you, Father," said Maddox simply, slipping the chain about his neck. "Ah, that is well," said the little curé with satisfaction. "And now, monsieur, I venture to ask you, will you let me change your room? I have one, not as good as yours, I admit it, but which has in it a small opening into the church. You will perhaps repose yourself better there. You will permit?" "With great pleasure," said Maddox fervently. "You are very kind to me, Father." The little man patted his hand. "It is that I like you very much, monsieur," he said naively, "and I am not altogether a fool. We of Brittany see much that we do not look at, and hear much to which we do not listen." "Father," said Maddox awkwardly, I want to ask you something. When I began to read out that paper, you remember?" The curé nodded uneasily. You said that it was an invocation, that it summoned celui-là. Did you mean the devil?" "No, my son, I cannot tell you. It has no name with us of Kerouac. We say simply celui-là. You will not, if you please, speak of it again. It is not good to speak of it. No, I can imagine it isn't, said Maddox, and the conversation dropped. Maddox certainly slept better that night. In the morning he told himself that this might be for more than one reason. The bed, it might be more comfortable, but he knew it wasn't that. Or he might have overtired himself the day before, or the little cure's offering might somehow have given him a kind of impression of safety and protection without really having the least power to guard him. His feeling of security increased when the priest announced, "Tomorrow we have another guest, monsieur. Monsieur Foster has done me the honor to accept my invitation for a visit." "Foster? Really? Excellent!" cried Maddox. He felt that the doctor stood for science and civilization and sanity and all the comfortable, reassuring things of life that were so utterly lacking in the desolate wilderness of Kerouac. Sure enough, Foster came next day and was just as stolid and ugly and completely reassuring as Maddox had hoped he would be, and half feared he would not. He seemed to be ignoring his friend's physical condition at first, but on the day after his arrival he got to business. "Maddox, I don't know how you expect to get fit again," he said. "You came here for the air as much as anything. I said you were to take moderate exercise, yet here you stick, moping about this poky little house." Needless to say, Father Vettier was not present when this conversation took place. "What's wrong with the place, eh?" I'd have said it was excellent walking country. Maddox flushed a little. It's a bit boring walking alone," he said evasively, well aware that boring was not the right word. "Perhaps, yes, but you can get out a bit more now I'm here to come along. You might take me out this afternoon. The cure's going off to some kind of conference." Maddox wondered uneasily how much Foster knew. Had he come by chance off his own bat, or had Father Vettier been worried about his first guest and sent for him? If that was so, what exactly had the priest said? He thought he'd soon get that out of Foster. They walked along the beach, farther than Maddox had yet been. He had avoided the shore of late, and he had not felt up to going so far when he first came to Kerouac. Yet, though he knew he had never been on that particular reach of shore, the place seemed familiar. It is, of course, a common thing to feel that one knows a place which one is now seeing for the first time. But the impression was so extremely vivid that Maddox couldn't help remarking on it to his companion. "Rot, my dear man," said Foster bluntly. "You haven't been in Brittany before, and you say you've never been as far as this. It's not such uncommon country, you know. It's like lots of other places." "I know," said Maddox, but he was not satisfied. He was poor company for the rest of the walk, and was very silent on the way home. No amount of chaff from Foster could rouse him, and at last the doctor abandoned the effort. The men reached the presbytery in silence. The next day was close, threatening rain, though the downpour held off from hour to hour. Neither of the two Englishmen felt inclined to walk under that lowering sky. Father Vettier had a second urgent summons from his sick parishioner at Cap Morel, and set off, wrapped in a curious garment of tarpaulin, soon after the second déjeuner. He remarked that he might take the occasion of being so near to Préneuf to pay some visits there, and that he probably would not be in until nightfall. "If monsieur should feel disposed," he said rather shyly to Maddox before he left, "Monsieur Foster might be interested to see the alterations I propose for the church. He has taste, Monsieur Foster. It might amuse him." He was so clearly keen to display his decorations, and yet a little afraid of appearing vain if he showed them himself, that Maddox smiled. "I'm sure he'd like to see them," he said gently. Yet, though he could have given no possible reason for it, he felt strongly disinclined to go near that half-ruined wall, with its stretch of painting only half displayed. He knew it was absurd. He'd worked there till he was tired. He'd been startled by the howling of a dog. That was all. No doubt, when he came to look at it again, he would find that the fresco was the merest clumsy daub, and that his own overwrought nerves, together with the uncanny light of the gloaming and the beastly dog, had exaggerated into something sinister and horrible. He declared to himself that if he had the courage to go and look again, he would simply laugh at himself and his terrors. But at the back of his mind, he knew that he would never have gone alone, and it was a mixture of bravado and a kind of hope that Foster's horse sense would lay his terror for him, that finally induced him to propose a visit to the place. Foster was interested, mildly, by what Maddox told him of the painting on the ruined wall. He went out first to the rough little churchyard. Maddox, half reluctantly, went to fetch down the little case he had picked up on the beach in order that Foster might with his own eyes compare the two inscriptions. And when he did go out to join his friend, he could hardly bring himself to go over to the wall he'd worked on. It took quite an effort to force his feet over to it. But the decoration was not quite as he had remembered it. The figures were so indistinct and faint that they were hardly visible. In fact, Maddox could well believe that a stranger would not recognize the daub as representing figures at all. His relief at this discovery was quite absurd. He felt as if an immense and crushing weight had been lifted from his spirit, and his first anxiety over, he bent to examine the rest of the painting more attentively. That was nearly exactly as he remembered it. A pile of stones with the half-illegible words, the tumbled huddle of seaweed or rags lying before it, the long reach of shore. Ah, that was it. "Foster, come look here," he said. "Where?" asked the doctor, strolling over. "Look, this fresco, whatever it is. I said that bit of shore we saw yesterday was familiar. This is where I saw it." Might be. All very much alike, though, this part of the beach. I don't see anything to get worked up about. "Oh, if you're going to take that line," cried Maddox, exasperated. "You doctors are all alike. Keep calm, don't get excited, nothing to worry about." He broke off, gulping with sheer rage. "My dear Maddox," said Foster, startled by his silent friend's outburst. "I'm awfully sorry. I wasn't trying to snub you in the least. I simply thought—" He too broke off. Then he decided to risk another annoyance. "What have you got on your mind?" he asked, rather urgently. "Tell me, Maddox, there's a good chap. What is it?" He paused hopefully, but Maddox had dried up. He couldn't explain. He knew that his solid, comfortable friend could never understand that his terror was not imaginary. He could not bear to watch him soothing down his friend, to see the thought hysteria in his mind. Yet it would be a relief to tell. "Look at this," he said at last. He took from his pocket the case he had found on the beach. "What do you make of that paper?" he asked. Foster moved out of the shadow of the wall so that the pale watery sunlight, struggling through the clouds, fell on the parchment. Maddox, a little relieved by the serious way he took it, turned back to examine the painting again. It was certainly very odd that the figures, which he remembered so clearly and which had seemed so very distinct, should now appear so dim that he doubted their reality. They seemed even fainter now than they had when he had looked at them a few minutes ago. And that heap flung beneath the hillock, what did that represent? He began to wonder whether that too were a figure. A drowned man, perhaps. He bent closer, and as he stooped, he was aware that someone beside him was looking over his shoulder, almost leaning on him. "Odd, Foster, isn't it?" he said. "What do you make of that huddled thing under the stones?" There was no answer, and Maddox turned. Then he sprang to his feet with a shuddering cry that died in his throat. The thing so close to him was not his friend. It was the hooded creature of the beach. Foster found the parchment so interesting that he was anxious to see it more clearly. He peered at it closely for a minute and then decided to go into the presbytery for a light. He had some difficulty with the old-fashioned oil lamp, but when he finally got it burning, he thought that the document fully repaid his trouble. He became so absorbed that it wasn't for some minutes that he realized that it was growing very dark and that Maddox had not yet come in. He felt quite disproportionately anxious as he hurried out to the tiny, overgrown churchyard. He was startled into something very like panic when he found no one there. Without reason, he knew that there was something horribly wrong, and blindly obeying the same instinct, he rushed out of the tiny enclosure and ran at his top speed down to the beach. He knew that he would find whatever there was to find on that lonely beach that was pictured on the old wall. There was a faint glimmer of daylight still, enough to confuse the light until Foster, half distraught with nameless fear, could hardly tell substance from shadow. But once he thought he saw ahead of him two figures, one a man's, and the other a tall, wavering shape, almost indistinguishable in the gloom. The sand dragged at his feet till they felt like lead. He struggled on, his breath coming in gasps that tore his lungs. Then, at last, the sand gave way to coarse grass, and then to a stretch of salt marshland, where the mud oozed up over his shoes, and water came lapping about his ankles. Open pools lay here and there, and he saw, as he struggled and tore his feet from the viscous slime, horrible creatures like toads or thick squat fish moving heavily in the watery ooze. The light had almost gone as he reached the line of beach he knew, and for one terrible moment he thought he was too late. There was the pile of stones. Beneath them lay a huddled black mass. Something, was it a shadow? Wavered, tall and vague above the heap, and before it squatted a shape that turned Foster cold. Something thick, lumpish, like an enormous toad. He screamed as he dragged his feet from the loathsome mud that clooped and gulped under him, screamed aloud for help. Then suddenly he heard a voice, a human voice. "In nomine Dei omnipotenti," it cried. Foster made one stupendous effort and fell forward on his knees. The blood sang in his ears, but through the hammering of his pulses he heard a sound like the howling of a dog dying away in the distance. "It was by the providence of the good God that I was there," said Father Bettier afterwards. "I do not often come by the shore. We of Kerouac, monsieur, we do not like the shore after it is dusk, but it was late and the road by the shore is quicker. Indeed, I think the good saints led me, but if my fear had been stronger so that I had not gone that way, and it was very strong, monsieur, I do not think that your friend would be living now." "Nor do I," said Foster soberly. "My God, Father, it was nearly over. Sacrificium hominum, that beastly paper said. I saw the loathsome thing waiting. He was lying in front of that hellish altar, or whatever it was. Why, Father, why did it have that power over him?" "I think it was that he read the invocation aloud," said the curé slowly. "He called it, and you see, monsieur, he said the words. What he saw at first is often seen. We are used to it, we of Kerouac. We call it celui-là, but it is, I believe, only a servant of that other." "Well," said Foster soberly, "you're a brave man, Padre. I wouldn't spend an hour here if I could help it. As soon as poor Maddox can travel, I'm going home with him. As to living here alone—" "And you are right to go," said Father Vettier gravely. "But for me, no, monsieur. It is my post, do you see? And one prays, monsieur. One prays. Always."
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody dies. Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the wrong room today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back? What's the secret?
Hello, that was Celui-là by Eleanor Scott. I'm going to tell you something about her. Some of you listened to a previous one I did a couple of weeks ago by Seabury Quinn, who was a Frenchman in that. And I was a bit over the top, deliberately so. I was aiming for the allo allo type French. I thought I'd be a bit more subtle in this. You only will be the judges of whether I succeeded or not. Anyway, let me tell you about the lady author. She wasn't called Eleanor Scott. I mean, she was, for the purposes of work, it was a nom de plume. But she's real name was Helen Madeline Lays, and she was born in 1892, 11th of July, in fact, in Hampton Hill, Middlesex. She died in 1965 in Devon, so that means it's 60 years since she died. So technically this story's still in copyright.
She was a British educator and writer whose work, although initially overlooked, is now gaining renewed appreciation for its subtly unsettling atmosphere and exploration of folk horror themes. All there, wasn't it? Whilst a given name was Helen Madeline Leys, she wrote under a number of pseudonyms, one of which was Eleanor Scott. So her father, John Kirkwood Leys, was a novelist himself, and she was educated and went on to a career in education and actually worked for most of her professional life at a teacher training college in Oxfordshire. And so this, as the notes say, it was a respectable if unremarkable path for a woman of her time. But she liked dark themes. Her first novel, which was published when she was 36, was War Among Ladies, given the controversial subject matter of the book. I think she was kind of ridiculing it, really. So, otherwise, you wouldn't have thought it's that controversial. And her position as a teacher, so she adopted the name Eleanor Scott, but also she wrote as P.R. Shaw as well. She published in 1929, so the year after her War Among Ladies book. I don't have a copy of that. She had a collection of her own stories called Randall's Round. Now, she said that many of the stories in that collection came to her in dreams. Definitely she admits to inspirations from M.R. James and Algernon Blackwood. I see more James in this than Blackwood, to be honest. It's not particularly mystical as such, but there are kind of religious themes in it, or religious people in it. But, whereas Algernon tends to be a bit mystical and talk about, like Descent into Egypt, which I've done, or The Man Whom the Trees Loved, which I've done, or The Willows. There's all this kind of nature mysticism in it, I think. I don't get that here, but certainly M.R. James. So, Randall's Round, it was published, didn't do massively well. And also, she used Eleanor Scott to publish other novels, but she may also be N. Dennett, who wrote Unburied Vein and The Men Here. So there isn't much known about her that I could find. Somebody may have a biography about her. I haven't been able to find it. So this one, Celui-là, was published in 1929 in the interwar period, but always, I've said this before, writers tend to write, not even when they're writing a story, a contemporary story, unless they deliberately make it so, they're usually writing about when they were younger, and so the world that they portray is usually a younger world. This feels quite pre-war to me, sort of Edwardian, when she would have been a young woman. She was born 1892, so in the first decade she was 18 in 1910, and then, early 20s before the First World War. So let's have a look at this. It's so M.R. James, isn't it? The beach, for one thing. M.R. James, he loves his beaches. I mean, of course, Whistle, but also Warning to the Curious. Always, I know it isn't totally beachy, but it feels a bit beachy to me. And what was that other one where... There's another one. Anyway, he loves his beaches, although they're usually in East Anglia rather than in Brittany. Same idea though. I talked in a different story. I did a story set in Cornwall, and I talked about how when you're writing a ghost story or gothic literature, the writer tends to put it somewhere a bit different, because it's the idea that this couldn't happen in my street. Look how boring it is. There's a convenience store, there's a booze buster, there's a chain pub, there's a Pizza Express. What weird stuff could go on. I mean, a totally good writer could actually probably do make something of all of those settings. I think, who did that thing? It was Grady Hendrix Horror Store, and he set it in an IKEA store. I've never read any of his other stuff. He looks really great, and I'm going to read him. But I've got a massive pile, and I go to the bookshop and I think, oh yeah, I'm going to buy this. And many times I've almost got to the pay counter, the till as we would call it, and put it back. But I've got a million books to read, so I will get to it because it looks really good. But anyway, going back to my point, usually your gothic author sets the story somewhere different. So either in the past, which is different, the past is another country, they do things differently there apparently, and or in a kind of romantic, weird place. And I'm talking about Cornwall,
that serves for, of course, the classic, Dracula's Transylvania, Camillia's Corinthia, Vathek and all of those ones, the Italian. They're always set to places that were exotic to the authors, usually British authors. So to them, Italy in the 1800s was a very exotic place, maybe still is. And I was saying also that, Britain itself has become that for some of the rest of the world. And I talked about Mexican Gothic that Silvia Garcia Moreno wrote, and she used England as the other place, like the Transylvania place, because I suppose to Mexicans England is quite exotic. And then I thought, I've read elsewhere that people, Europeans and others, do think that Britain, and particularly the kind of, but no, I think Britain in general, to people who aren't from Britain, seems very Harry Pottery, very Shirey, very Lord of the Rings, very stone circles and haunted villages kind of stuff. And of course it is. But if for the British themselves, and you've got to think about the population, where most of the population in Britain lives, and to the southeast of England, really. I think something like 2/3 of the population lives in a very small part of the islands, and so particularly the Celtic-y places, so the Highlands of Scotland. Ireland is clearly another country, but it serves that purpose for the British, and Wales, of course, and Cornwall, but of course Brittany as well. So Brittany is in the northwest of France. Of course, if you're Breton, you may say it's not in France at all. It was an independent country until it was subsumed into the French monarchy and then the empire. But they have their own language and their own Celtic traditions, and so they serve as other. So M.I. James wasn't particularly Celtic. I think I always find M.I. James a very Anglo-Saxon, actually. In the proper meaning of that, not in the modern meaning, but actually to do with Anglo-Saxons. And he was from East Anglia. It's a very Anglo-Saxon place. And that has its own mystery and charm. It's different and different feel from the Celtic stuff. But so that being aside, so also we have this single gentleman who is an M.R. James figure, and he knows a bit of his Latin. And I should just say that for those who pay attention to this kind of thing, I was attempting with the old French. So you may go, that didn't sound like French. You didn't do the Paris. You didn't do all the uvula R technically. And that's because in Old French that isn't what they said. The pronunciation of R became standard in about 16th, 17th century amongst the bourgeoisie in Paris and became fashionable and therefore spread. It still isn't the case in some dialects of French. In Breton, it has taken over a bit, but amongst older speakers, they still use that R. This isn't Breton, of course, this is Old French. In the south of France, they don't, they still use the R, trilled R, rather than that. I mean, you should actually listen to Simon Roper on YouTube if you're interested in, not in pronunciation of French particularly, but how sounds in English have developed and how fashionableness influences. And this R sound then was so fashionable it spread into Breton, as I said, but also into German and into Danish. And I think the Dutch have resisted it. Good for them. I'm a trilled R man myself, really. So I was attempting to pronounce the Old French at a rough estimation of how it might have sounded, rather than just rendering it as modern French. She doesn't write it as modern French. She writes it as Old French. So she's clearly an educated woman. Eleanor Scott, Helen Madeline Ray. So anyway, that's enough of that. So, but a very, very, and then of course I attempted. Now, you don't know if this goes through my head. So when I was doing the Latin, there are many ways of pronouncing Latin. The two main ways are the reconstructed classical Latin, which is an estimate of how Julius Caesar may have pronounced it, or Cicero, or somebody like that. And then there's the Church Latin. The Church Latin has an Italianate pronunciation in that it palatalizes, so it sounds more like Italian, which is, of course, Italian descends from Latin, as does French, but they went their different ways with their accents. But Italian palatalized, and probably that was happening in Vulgar Latin towards the end of the Roman period. In fact, I believe that is the case. Anyway, I mean, they say that French is just Latin spoken with a heavy Gaulish accent. It was Gaul before it was France, obviously. Anyway, so I get tied up in these things. I'm sorry if you're not interested, but you might, because in an order the number of people are interested in this kind of thing, I found out. And so, so the Latin, getting back to that, my pronunciation, so I prefer the classical pronunciation rather than the church Latin, although to be fair, I started it as classical Latin, and I pronounced it as reconstructed classical Latin, and I got to convoco at the end, and classical Latin, that should be convoco. It sounds a bit silly. Convoco sounds better. And of course then I was thinking, well, if this is an incantation, it's going to be church Latin, it's not going to be classical Latin anyway. So I maybe went a bit too classical, and I should have put a bit more palatalization in there. There you go. You know, one makes these choices when one is narrating. You do have to do that, you know, and sometimes, so it leads to the question, how do I make the choices? Well, whim, really. Fancy, whim, how I'm particularly feeling that day, but also in many cases how I'm disposed to. Like, I prefer the classical Latin pronunciation, so I'm generally going to go for that, except when it becomes obvious to me that actually this is a medieval or a church Latin thing, in which case I'm going to have to do it like that. And some words that I often say I just like pronouncing in a certain way, so the classic one is macabre. The one I'm going to mention, I'm going to leave like a hot potato, is Bowie, as in a knife, or David. But he wasn't David Bowie, was he? Now, some people call him David Bowie, some people call him David Bowie. Yeah. And everybody thinks their pronunciation is right. And that's probably a human characteristic. I've noticed, one of the things that's become really apparent to me is reading comments from the public, is everybody thinks they're right. So nobody for a second seems to, even me probably, seems to believe that or acknowledge that this is just my opinion. You know, that no, this is how it's done. And everybody, you know, I don't like Mozart, he's crap. And you're like, okay, Shakespeare's dull. And you go like, okay, Wittgenstein was an idiot. And you're like, right, yeah. Somebody said, I was talking about, what's his name, Hoffman, the physicist dude, can't remember his name now. Anyway, it doesn't matter why, but people say, he doesn't know what he's talking about. I think this is a guy with 1 million PhDs, utterly published, highly respected. I don't know who you are, dude, making that comment, but you might just be a bloke who makes pastry. But, you know, and people are like that. Never mind. I couldn't have one of these without having a rant, could I? And it's not a ramble, it's a rant. Where were we with the story about? I haven't got much to say about the story, basically, other than I really liked it. I liked it because it was like M.R. James. And we were looking at the M.R. Jamesian things. The beach, the lonely beach, the weird figure on the beach. The bizarre toad. He often has animals like the cats in Barchester Cathedral. But slightly malevolent, or not slightly malevolent, pretty malevolent creatures. Toads, because they're cold-blooded, if you ever touch a toad, it's like, ooh, it's cold. And full of bones. It's like a cold bag of bones. I don't dislike them, but they do feel weird. So, I mean, when was the last time you touched a toad, Tony? Probably some years now. But I would jump at the chance to do it again, honestly. I missed the frog spawn this year as well. Did I see any? I didn't see any. I hope the frogs are alright. I saw some frogs. Quite a lot of frogs in a pond. That was cool. But I haven't seen... there must be tadpoles around now. Anyway. So, Latin, finding something buried in the sand. M.R. James. It has Latin on it. You meddle with it and you read the ancient words. Big mistake. Totally M.R. James though. And then also this building weirdness, this weird stuff that happens with there are no explanations for it. You know, even at the end, what is it? Celui-là, that there. You know, the thing, if you like. Following a great translation. But, you know, that there. It is, and I said before that James absolutely doesn't explain the weirdness. He has many other techniques. Well, he has several techniques, as well. But one of the great ones for me is he doesn't explain. But what are these things in his stories? Actually, we don't know. And she exactly does the same thing. What is it? And we're left to speculate. Some kind of demonic spirit of the place, linked to the pagan past, to do with human sacrifice. But also the toad. Yeah, the toad links it to this chthonic underworld nature, I think. So yeah, I think it's a pastiche of an M.R. James story. However, it's a really good and enjoyable one. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was very well written. I enjoyed narrating it. And to say that, you know, she's just taken the elements of an M.R. James story, it isn't any insult to her. It's not a slight to her. She does it really well. And if you want to write your own story, just take those elements, boil them down, put them on the beach, maybe where you live. There'll be, you know, Santa Monica Pier. It's going to be a bit of a challenge because of the sunshine, but yeah, and I don't know what it's like at the moment after the fires. But I think they're in Malibu, when they're a bit further up the coast. But you know, probably not going to be like it was. Maybe it is. Anyway, let's forget that. But you know, what's that famous Copacabana beach? You could set it there. Probably not. I would pick somewhere. I think Norway would work. Iceland would work. The Faroes would work. You could have a remote Mediterranean out somewhere in Greece. The Greek would work, wouldn't it? But if you get to the classical stuff, you're a bit more Robert Aikman in M.R. James. He, although he was a classicist, you know, in the sense of M.R. James, he doesn't come out in his work, does it? He's more your medieval North European bloke. Whereas I think Aikman, I think the Cicerones really, nods more to classical myth. But I think you could get away with it. I'm thinking of Robert Graves and the White Goddess and stuff there. Anyway, I'm kind of composing a story on the fly here. Yeah, so elements. Oh, somewhere off the coast of Ireland. Yeah, absolutely. Those are your easy ones to challenge you. If you want to be a bit more Germanic, go to Norway or a remote Danish island, somewhere in the Baltic. Oh yeah, the North German coast would probably work really well. Yeah, I think you could do it. And I'm making it the Latin, this and not a whistle, not a Maltese falcon, but you know, some kind of MacGuffin. And it's got an inscription, and of course when you read the inscription, something wicked, this way comes, or Ray Bradbury. That's actually Shakespeare that he borrowed. There we are. Anyway, so there, free story for you. Good story. When I mean a free story, I mean the one that you're going to write and you're going to submit. And if it's really, really good, I'll read it out for you. How about that? But it better be good, though. It's got to be good. But it could be. So don't shy away. Buckle down. Get writing. Oh, yeah, you can buy my books now. You know, I had that bad situation whereby Amazon, anyhow, let's not go into that, but Amazon decided that I was persona non grata and they wouldn't allow me to sell any books of my own. I managed to sell them through my publishing company. Listen, you know, they're not a publishing company in the sense of they think I'm wonderful. They just publish books and take a cut, okay? So it's like most publishing companies, but they didn't give me an advance, or they didn't recognise my genius or anything like that. It was purely, it's like a self-publishing thing really, apart from they do it. Yeah, so it's not really self-publishing, but it is sort of like self-publishing. Anyway, so you can buy them directly, and so I'll put a link in the show notes if you want to buy my books, to see if I talk the talk, but do I walk the walk? Do I write the write? So, you know, I talk about, oh, you write this great story, just do this, bap, there you go. Well, you read my stories and you say, that guy, he's full of hot air. Anyway, I've gone on far too long. We're over the hour now. I hope you're all well.